Analysis for some opening remarks.
I think Dr. Carey may be a little bit late because she's stuck in traffic, but good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome everybody to the today's CFG meeting. I'll begin with a few short comments today. I'm sure many of you are aware that our friend and colleague and the CFG chairman, Dr. Frank O'Connor, passed away on September 30th after a brief illness. I know that I, along with many of you, are keeping Dr. O'Connor's family in our thoughts and prayers during this difficult time. You know, I think somebody said a little bit earlier that Dr. O'Connor was a fine economist, and that he was. He was also a fine, an even better human being. Dr. O'Connor had a lot of accomplishments. He joined Eastern Kentucky University in 1989 and was chair of that department, economics department, from 1989 to 1997. And he remained at EKU until he retired. Ever since arriving in Kentucky, for over 3 decades, Dr. O'Connor served the Commonwealth as part of the revenue forecasting process. From 1989 to 1992, Dr. O'Connor served on the Governor's Economic Roundtable. That was an advisory group that assisted in the revenue estimating process at that time. In 1996, Senate Bill 59 was passed, and that formally established the Consensus Forecasting Group. And Dr. O'Connor became a member of the CFG in 1999, so he's been the longest serving member of the CFG. In 2013, after Dr. Lynch resigned from the CFG as a chairman, Dr. O'Connor assumed the chair at that time. So for today's meeting, we have asked Dr. Bruce Johnson, and he has agreed to assume the chair today and lead the group through their deliberations. Before Dr. Johnson starts the meeting, I'd like to turn it over to Greg Harkenreiter for a few comments. Thank you.
Just a few remarks to add to what Perry said. Very few benefits to sitting on the CFG. It's not a paid gig, but one of the things that always came out in Dr. O'Connor was the sense of fraternity and camaraderie that you all develop amongst one another, and he embraced those concepts, first as his role as a member and then as his role as the chair in 2013. I'm sure everybody has their own Frank memory. He was a great storyteller, and he had various and numerous insightful memories to share. My favorite memory was the times that he invited me up to EKU. We did a meet and greet with some of his students one time. We talked for about an hour and a half on forecasting methods, and a couple things struck me. One was that he was always eager to help his students gain useful tools that would help them after their graduation. And the other thing that just struck me was how proud he was of EKU and how gracious of a host he was to anybody that come his way. The other thing I remember the most as a staff person and a presenter to the CFG, he was very gracious with us, and he read the materials ahead of time, and he always gave me the professional courtesy if something was wrong in his eyes or inconsistent, or there was something that was a perceived going to be a glitch in the meeting, he would call me ahead of time and say, Greg, what about this? And he wasn't about gotcha moments, saving up a insightful comment and then springing it on you in the meeting. And he was never about that. It was always about the good of the process, and everything was good of the process over anything personal or otherwise. So he was always able to graciously garner a consensus, and he will be missed by staff here. Thank you.
All right, and if I might just add a few words about Frank. I don't remember when I first met Frank, but it was a long time ago, soon after I arrived in Kentucky to work at Center College, probably a KEA meeting. And after that initial meeting, I do know that he was always very kind and encouraging. I wrote a few op-ed pieces back when we had daily newspapers, and Frank would often, the next time we saw, or even by email, send me a note. I really enjoyed your piece. Sometimes he didn't agree with me, but it was always civil, and I just felt like it was just so great to have someone of his stature be kind, express a genuine interest, and be kind. I will miss him a lot. And I'm sure other members of the CFG would have similar stories. Are you gentlemen ready to
We are.
proceed? Okay.
Could you toggle on to the first slide, please?
Sure.
We're going to go a little bit different than the agenda. I'm going to do the first slide, then we're going to trickle to the economy, the state, or the national and state economies, and then I'm going to flip back to the introductory slides because they pertain a lot more to revenues than they do to anything else, and I didn't want to have revenues and then the economy and then lose the continuity. So I'm just going to start with why we're here today. The statutes were revised in the 2023 session. The August 15th planning estimates, if you remember, on odd numbered years, which this is an odd numbered year, we would meet in August, October, and December. The August estimates were the 4-year planning estimates. We did the current fiscal year and 4 years out. Those were eliminated in House Bill 360, so we don't have to do 4-year estimates, which I'm thankful for. The October 15th estimates, which from the prior statute were called the preliminary estimates, and we still have preliminary estimates that just say were moved up to September 30th. So no longer October 15th is the deadline. September 30th is our new deadline, hence our meeting today on the 25th. And finally, the last change that took place was that the official estimates upon which statutorily the budget has to be based didn't have a date certain per se in the old statute. It was the 15th legislative day. The custom was always to do it in December. And in fact, every cycle I remember, we did it in December. But the Section 39 of House Bill 360 changed it and made it official that it would be done by December 20th. So we have a hard deadline of December 20th. It was always done in December to accommodate the workings of government, to let the governor get his budget out and so forth. But now we have a firm hard date on December 20th. So that's why we're here in September instead of October. And with that, I'm going to delay the rest of my introduction until after Dr. Michael Jones goes through the economic forecast that we'll consider today.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Unfortunately, turning 50 has caused me to now have to use reading glasses. So life can be cruel, I must say. So, well, it's wonderful to see everybody. I really want to say I appreciate everyone's heartfelt words about Frank. He was a very caring and generous man, and his presence will certainly be missed. So I'm going to discuss the national and state outlook. This is based upon the S&P Global forecast that was published in early August. As you might imagine, there are assumptions in here that we have been able to peek a little bit ahead, and we know that there may or may not be trouble down the road on a few of these variables. But the main control scenario, weighted at 55% probability, assumes that our fears of near-term recession have begun to ebb, increased real GDP compared to earlier forecasts by S&P Global, now assuming 1.9% growth in fiscal 24 with 1.2 and 1.5% growth in fiscal 25 and 26 respectively. That is a little below trend for those out years, but the 1.9% is a recent revision upwards from S&P's earlier estimates that have occurred during the end of fiscal 23 and now that we're in fiscal 24. A significant portion of that is associated with a very strong surge in business fixed investment due to the CHIPS Act. They correctly point out that on an annualized basis, since 2010, we have never had more than an annualized $20 billion in ongoing investment properties being built, and we are now at well over $100 billion worth of properties. Part of the CHIPS Act, it's not just the equipment, it's also the facility itself. And rather than a 10% income tax credit, it's a 25% income tax credit. As you might imagine, given the broad nature of what is covered and the richness of the tax credit, firms have certainly responded, and we have seen a tremendous amount of investment. They assume the Federal Reserve will maintain their federal funds rate in the 5.5 to 5.75% all the way through the second quarter of fiscal 24, and they're going to continue to further reduce the current balance sheet. They're assuming that the growth rate in payrolls will be declining, and we will be switching over to negative growth in fiscal 25 and 26. And let's be honest, they are assuming we need to have much more losses in the labor market for the Fed to be able to achieve their goal of 2% PCE growth, the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. We have been having positive payroll reports. The most recent payroll report, which of course came out after this report, continued to show positive numbers. So they're expecting those positives to get smaller and smaller and transition to losses as we get farther out in the forecast. We've had declines from the recent highs for West Texas Intermediate oil prices. They're expecting $73.90 a barrel for fiscal 24, with a slight increase to just shy of $75 in fiscal 25 and just a little over $80 in fiscal 26. Now, as you might imagine, that has to compare to our optimistic scenario. Now, this is unusual. It's only weighted by 20%. That might be one of the lower weightings I've seen on an optimistic scenario from S&P Global in quite some time. The GDP growth is much stronger, 2.4% in fiscal 24, with trend level growth that would be 1.2 and 1.5% in the control forecast. The growth in the out years in the optimistic forecast is at 2.4% in fiscal 24 and 1.8 and 1.7% in 25 and 26 respectively. So again, much closer to trend growth that we've observed over the last several years. Again, business fixed investment does remain elevated in the optimistic scenario. Employment increases by 1.5% in fiscal 24. That's versus 1.3 in the control forecast. Real personal income growth of 2.4% in fiscal 24 versus 1.7% in the control forecast. Light vehicle sales increase by 6.8 and 8.7% respectively, compared to 5.1 in both of the out years in the control forecast. And then the cessation of active fighting in the Russian-Ukraine conflict is expected to lower world energy prices, of course, specifically Brent prices. While I hope that's the case, that is a large assumption to occur in the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario, weighted at 25%, is more pessimistic, to say the least. Russian-Ukraine conflict increases. GDP growth declines to 1.3%. I apologize for that mistake. In fiscal 24 and 0.6% in fiscal 25. Again, that compares to 1.9 and 1.2% in the control forecast for those years respectively. They assume that the recent turmoil with Silicon Valley Bank and others leads to significant tightening lending standards and reduces credit expansion. The consumer spending growth slows to 1.3% in 24 and 0.9% in 25. That's compared to 2% and 1.5% in the control forecast. Non-farm employment decreases by 1.5% in 25. It's a 0.1% in the control forecast, with manufacturing employment decreasing by 4.4% in fiscal 25 versus the 2.7% that you'll see in the control forecast. So again, much stronger declines in the pessimistic forecast. Unemployment rate increases to 6.4% by the end of fiscal 25. That's versus 4.2 in the control forecast. And they assume that the Russia-Ukraine conflict increases and the intensity increases, and that drives world oil back over $100 a barrel. So that's the overall assumptions. Now, what is not in here, let me just say this. The control forecast absolutely assumed no government shutdown. They stated correctly at the time that the agreement that was struck was supposed to allow for a suspension of the debt ceiling. There would not be a government shutdown at the end of September 30th, which of course is the end of the federal fiscal year. And we know that we cannot say that that is the case right now. So baked in here, especially in the control forecast, assumes no federal government shutdown. So here's our classic control optimistic pessimistic line chart for real GDP, and you can see that optimistic line has a slope that you would associate with what we would call trend growth, but you can see in the control forecast the blue and clearly in the red forecast the pessimistic how we have slower growth in the out years. And to drive that home, we have our bar chart here for the control optimistic pessimistic. And again, you can see that optimistic forecast quite strong in each of the years, the green bar relative to our base forecast with the 1.9, 1.2, and 1.5% respectively. And then, of course, the pessimistic forecast with that 1.3 all the way down to 0.6 or 25 and then back up to 1.4. Here's our employment forecast. Now here you can strongly see the difference. That control forecast is almost identical to the optimistic forecast, but that pessimistic forecast is clearly highly divergent from either path that the other two forecasts. And when you put that into terms here, you can see that we start to go into that negative territory. Now again, S&P Global is assuming that this will be a necessary result of the Fed continuing to try to drive down inflation to get back to their 2% target, which S&P Global does estimate will be achieved by the end of fiscal 25. But there will be some pain along the way, and their forecast reflects that. The pessimistic forecast, of course, has fairly significant declines. Now, that is nothing compared to the manufacturing forecast, where again, that pessimistic line dives down strongly, putting us almost back to where we were during the initial hit of the slowdown in work that occurred because of COVID at the end of fiscal 20. Whereas again, the control and optimistic are hardly different. And here again, you can see it in the bar chart. The control forecast, a slight decline of 0.5%, then to 2.7 in 25 and 2.1 in 26. More optimistic, of course, with the green forecast, but that pessimistic forecast in red shows some pretty strong growth, again, with that large decline, 4.4% in fiscal 25. Here's our real personal income, obviously real it's been adjusted for inflation, and you can see that the control and optimistic, again, are fairly tight band, but with the pessimistic being more divergent, but nowhere near as significant as it was in the employment variables. Percentage-wise, you can see coming off very flat growth in 23, again, real personal income adjusted for inflation. You can see 1.7, 2.3, and 2.2 for the control forecast, whereas the optimistic forecast has a little growth sooner, about the same in the end. I probably should have expanded the decimal places. Obviously, for fiscal 26, it's not exactly 2.2 in both cases. Optimistic slightly higher. But in that pessimistic forecast, 0.7, 1.3, and 2.7%. Again, reflecting a shift due to the assumptions in the pessimistic forecast. Now here's our wage and salary disbursements. Of course, these are nominal, and you can see again a much tighter band in the control optimistic pessimistic forecast. And overall, falling from our 6.6% observed growth in fiscal 23 and our control forecast 4.9, 4.2, 3.9, so just a slow decline versus much better, but still declining, rates of wage and salary disbursements in the optimistic, and again, the pessimistic showing a larger fall in fiscal 25 of 2.7%. Here's our real consumer spending. Now, this is excluding food and energy, so it's adjusted for inflation, but it excludes the most volatile areas of inflation. And you can see the optimistic and control fairly well spaced, but again, that decline that you see in the pessimistic forecast. Percentage-wise, coming off of 2.8%, the control forecast 2%, 1.5, 1.9, much more optimistic in the optimistic scenario, 2.5, 2.1. And then again, that pessimistic forecast, again, bottoming out in 25, like a lot of the other variables. Housing starts, I mean, I know everyone has been listening to a lot of statistics about what's been going on in the housing market. They've seen the how tight the housing market is. We've hit a near-term record in terms of the number of housing starts applied for. And you can see in the optimistic and control scenario, fairly similar assumptions, but again, a fairly strong decline in the pessimistic forecast. Again, essentially slightly negative to flat in the control and optimistic scenarios, or some slight growth, but in that pessimistic scenario, 5.4% decline, followed by a 4.8% decline, and then recovering to positive again in fiscal 26. Our medium sales price of existing family homes, they've been keeping track since the mid-50s of what percentage of owner-occupied existing homes are vacant, assuming that they would be available for sale. And we have hit a near-term low since statistics were kept. Only 0.7% of all existing housing is currently vacant, owned by a homeowner, meaning it could be brought to market to, respond to these high prices. And it's the smallest it's ever been observed since it started collecting that data back in the mid-50s. And you can see here that the optimistic and control scenarios are almost no different, but again, that pessimistic scenario a little bit lower. The affordability, of course, for housing, if any of you have children who are in their mid-20s to 30s, it's common to hear people say, well, I just don't know if I'll ever be able to afford a house. And so looking at these forecasts, this near-term drop in fiscal 24 would be seen by a lot of people to be a two-prong, more supply being brought on as new homes are constructed. And of course, that faces pressure as an obvious substitute for existing single-family homes. But again, in the out years, fiscal 24 and 25, except for the pessimistic, we're talking about growing prices again. Well, with high interest rates and prices growing in 25 and 26, I could see why some people are concerned that they'll never be able to get into a house. So hopefully that will not be the case, and the interest rates will fall as we continue to move forward. But nominal consumption of gasoline and oil, now this is a classic example where it reverses. The pessimistic shows a higher line because, again, in the pessimistic assumptions, prices go up. So this is our consumption of gas and oil in billions of dollars. So you can see the control forecast is actually the lowest, with the optimistic forecast a little higher due to positive economic activity leading to higher demand for gasoline and oil, and in the pessimistic, much higher, but due to negative influences driving world oil prices due to expansion of the Ukraine and Russia conflict. Light sales of new vehicles, we've all heard and seen the stories of what happened after COVID, the chip shortage. So we do see a forecast here, fairly strong growth, like I said in the introductory remarks on the forecast scenarios. The optimistic does show some fairly strong growth in vehicles. The control, of course, right there in the middle, but the pessimistic assumes an immediate decline off of today's highs, and then weak to falling growth as we continue out through the forecast period. Again, you can see it in the numbers in the bar chart, 5.1% in the control forecast as compared to that relatively strong optimistic forecast, which I mentioned, and then compared to the pessimistic, 0.5, 2.8, and then a fall of 3.4% in the out year in the pessimistic forecast. Real exports of goods and services, one would think the weakening of the dollar, they're expecting exports of goods and services to finally reap the rewards of the American dollar falling a little bit in terms of relative strength. So essentially all three forecasts have strong growth from here on out through the forecast period when it comes to exports of goods and services. Unfortunately, a little more important to us here in Kentucky, the real export of motor vehicles and parts is not expected to benefit as broadly as the overall expansion of exports of goods and services. All three forecasts have us declining in the near term with a slight uptick at the end in terms of exporting motor vehicles and parts. Again, one of our signature industries here in the Commonwealth. That is all of the national slides. If there's any particular aspect or questions you might have, I'd be happy to answer them before I move on to the state outlook. Okay. Oh, all right. So here's the Kentucky non-farm employment. Much like in the national economy, not too much of a difference in the optimistic and the control forecast, but a fairly strong decline in that pessimistic forecast. And you can see in terms of the actual numbers, 0.5% followed by a decline of 0.2% and negative 0.1% in the control. Some growth in the near term in the optimistic, but again, negatives in the out years. And then again, that pessimistic forecast, quite pessimistic, 0.6% decline, followed by a 1.5% decline, mitigating to a 0.4% decline in fiscal 26. And like I said before, if you thought let me first compare the U.S. to Kentucky as a whole. You can see in the forecast period, slower growth in the Commonwealth in fiscal 24 in the control forecast, 0.5 versus 1.3 nationally. Essentially the same, 0.2% decline versus 0.1% for the U.S. as a whole, and then in the out year, slightly better for the Commonwealth, a 0.1% decline versus a 0.2% decline for the nation. What I was alluding to was, much like in the national numbers, our manufacturing employment is expected to have much more of a decline than the overall employment numbers. So here you can see the Kentucky manufacturing employment for the control optimistic pessimistic, and again, that pessimistic number, you can really see it diving down. Not quite as bad in the national numbers where it goes all the way down to where we were in fiscal 20 during the peak of COVID, but still quite a decline. And you can see that here, whereas in the control forecast, drop off in next year, fiscal 24 of negative 1.4%, and then improving slightly as we go out, minus 1.1 and minus 0.5. But again, compared to that pessimistic number, 2.6% decline in fiscal 24, followed by a 3.5% decline in 25 and a 1.2% decline in the out year fiscal 26. So quite a difference between the two. And here we are compared to the U.S. as a whole. Again, in fiscal 24, a little worse in the Commonwealth versus the U.S. as a whole. But then, much like in employment, in manufacturing employment, we certainly are doing a little bit better in 25, negative 1.1% versus 2.7% decline for the U.S. as a whole, and much better than the national in the out year, only a 0.5% decline versus a 2.1% decline. And if you read through the S&P Global forecast, you know that a lot of the manufacturing is coming off of the fact that we do have this big boom right now in manufacturing facilities being constructed from the CHIPS Act. But overall, across manufacturing broadly, most firms are facing tightening lending standards, of course, high borrowing rates as the Fed has continued to raise interest rates. And a lot of firms are just not seeing the need to continue to expand as they feel like they have caught up in many ways with the problems they were facing with offshoring becoming nearshoring, becoming onshoring for some firms. And they responded with those movements of people and plants. And now that that's in place, they're saying a lot of manufacturers don't see the need to continue that process. So it really is not just one issue that's causing this issue in manufacturing. But by our estimates, it does appear as though, especially with our concentration in both the aircraft and manufacturing of motor vehicles and motor vehicle parts, we will be less impacted than the nation as a whole, certainly in 25 and 26. Here's our personal income numbers, extremely tight band on these forecasts. Almost no difference that is appreciable in the line chart. You can see it better here in the column chart. So 3.6% growth in personal income in the control forecast, followed by 3.9, 3.9 in the out years. The optimistics, definitely more optimistic, 4.1%, 4.3, back to 4.1. And the pessimistic is not as pessimistic as some of the other forecast variables, with 3.2, 3.2, and finally coming back to 3.8% growth in the out year. Compared to the U.S., unfortunately, I hate to say it, but every year our forecasted personal income is lower than what is expected to occur in the nation as a whole. You can see there, nation's expected to be 4.6 to 4.7 in the near term, following to 4.3, and we're just slowly increasing from 3.6 to 3.9%. Here's our wages and salaries forecast. Now, in this case, the pessimistic does diverge. Unlike the personal income forecast, here in wages and salaries, we do have more of a divergence, as you can see, between the relatively similar optimistic and control as compared to the pessimistic. And you can see that here on the bar chart. Whereas in the control forecast of 4, 3.7, and 3.5, the pessimistic is down at 2.7, 2.2, coming back up again in the recovery period in fiscal 26. Here we're a little bit closer to the U.S. as a whole in fiscal 24, 4.9 for the U.S. as a whole versus 4% in the Commonwealth. And then the gap narrowing in 25 and 26, 4.2 compared to 3.7 in 25, and 3.9 compared to 3.5 in the Commonwealth in 26. And last but not least, transfer payments. Now, of course, those two spikes are associated with the direct payments from the federal government that went out for the COVID relief payments. Obviously, this forecast is so close, you may have thought we forgot to put the optimistic or pessimistic on the chart. You can just see pessimistic peeking out. And again, pessimistic would be slightly higher, assuming that in the pessimistic scenario, there would be more aid and more things sent out to people in general from the federal government. And you can see here in the chart, 2.8% growth, 3.5, 5.1 in the control forecast, optimistic, little less in the near term versus with 3.8 and 5.5, and then in the pessimistic forecast, 3.1, 4.2, 4.8%. So again, not a huge difference across all three forecasts, but again, coming off of the decline that we observed for fiscal 23, as so many of the federal programs have are wrapping up or slated to end very shortly. Now, one thing I did not mention in here, which may have come to mind, they assume there is no change in the restart for student loan payments. I should have added that at the very beginning in the control forecast. So the consumer spending numbers here assume that student loan payments do fully restart as expected this October. So, but they, again, did not assume any kind of federal government shutdown. So that's the entirety of our national and state outlook. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And if not, I will turn it over to Greg. All right, thank you very much. Look at me being all confident, taking off my reading glasses. Do you need me to forward slides, or are you going to do
No, I can deal with the mouse.
Perfect. And I'll let Gene take us.
Okay, we're going to start on the second slide of the introductory slides. This first chart was in the quarterly report that we did in July. I just want to explain it a little bit. The purpose of the chart is to show fiscal 23 actuals versus fiscal 23 official, but also fiscal 23 enacted. And the difference is, when were the estimates done? The fiscal 23 official estimates were done December 14th, 2022, in the special call made by the state budget director. And you can see the last time we got together, we are getting a little bit better at this. We forecasted $15,192.9 million. We got $15,147.7. So we over forecasted by $45.2 million, which is good forecasting. Had you taken the control, you would have done worse in terms of your absolute value of the air. So you were wise to take the optimistic. The only thing better would have been a blend, but anyway. But we did a lot of discussion in the quarterly report about versus the enacted, which was an estimate that was done December 17th, 2021. Versus that, we were off 1.4 billion. And I've got a chart about 4 graphs in that explains why that is. It wasn't so much in 23 that we missed the growth rate versus the enacted. The growth rate was reasonably close to what we ended up getting. We grew 3%. That wasn't far from what we projected. The the problem was we missed the base in 22. The base in 22 was under projected, which if you miss the base year of a 3-year forecast, you're kind of sunk because your 23 and your 24 are going to be off unless you get a little lucky and the growth rates flip on you. But that's the reasoning there. The next chart I'm not going to spend much time on. It just shows that in fiscal 23, the fourth quarter did what it was supposed to do in fall, and that was because the previous fourth quarter grew 16.9%. It was a huge fourth quarter in fiscal 22. So we had predicted a decline when we had our December 2022 estimates, and sure enough, it came in, and therefore our forecast was very close to where it needed to be. I'm going to mention 3 quick things about this chart. One is, the growth rates are sort of all over the place in terms of general fund growth since fiscal 10. The average growth rate, if you were to just take those, looks like 13 years and average them, it's 4.3%. But if for some reason you said, well, yeah, but that includes 10.9 and 14.6, if you took those two out, the growth rate, the long-term growth rate would be 2.9%. But why you would take those out, I'm not sure. So the sort of average general fund growth, at least recently, has been 4.3%. If you look at the big bulge in 21 and 22, 10.9% growth, 14.6% growth. In 21, that 10.9% growth led to a $1.1 billion budget surplus, or revenue surplus over the number. In fiscal 22, that 14.6% growth compares to the House Bill 1 estimates, and we missed that by $951 million. And even though 3% was roughly where we thought growth would be in 23, that forecasting year was the $1.4 billion that we talked about. And again, I've got a quarterly chart that shows this. The last thing I wanted to say about this slide was nominal growth. If you look at just growth between in fiscal 21 and fiscal 22, we grew $3.1 billion in 2 years. $3.1 billion in 2 years. I saw that and was my jaw dropped, and I thought, well, how long did it take before that to get $3.1 billion in growth? So you have to go back to fiscal 06 and run it through fiscal 20. For 14 years, you got about $3.1 billion of growth compared to just 2 years where we got $3.1 billion in growth. So I found that somewhat interesting. The next slide, I've got a better chart on quarterly growth on the next slide, so I'm not going to talk much about it except to note that 3.4% decline in the fourth quarter of 23 was the first quarterly decline since what I call the COVID quarter, the fourth quarter of fiscal 20. So we had an 11-quarter run of positive quarterly growth, which ended in the fourth quarter of fiscal 23. Now this graph is a little busy, but I want to spend a little time on it, unfortunately. Let's talk about the blue years for just a second. The blue years, we had 10.9% growth. In nominal terms, we had $1.3 billion in growth. We had a budget surplus of $1.1 billion, and in the fourth quarter of that year, we grew 24.8%. We had just done estimates. If you look at the second blue chart, the 5.3, we just done a fresh batch of estimates for fiscal 21 and fiscal 22, right there before the 5.3 was complete. As soon as you all left town, it just started growing gangbusters. We grew 6.7%. Is that a 6.7? Yeah, 6.7% in the third quarter and 24.8% in the fourth quarter. Granted, that's off that low COVID quarter, but 24.8%, that represented nominal growth in the fourth quarter of $756 million in a quarter. $756 million of growth in one quarter. Next, I want to talk about the orange years. No short bars in the orange year, fiscal 22. We had the worst quarter was 9.0%. The year as a total grew 14.6%. Just solid growth the whole year. Again, we've been meeting a lot, as you know. We did meet in the second quarter of fiscal 22 in December to do the budget estimates for 22, 23, and 24. It was December of 21, so it was a regular 3-meeting schedule of 2021. We met. We saw from the previous year how the last couple quarters ended. We took a fairly cautious approach because we thought there's no way we're going to be able to grow over 24.8% in the previous fiscal year. Yet what did we do? We grew 16.9% in the fourth quarter after a strong third quarter of 9.0%. We did forecast growth that year, but we were still $951 million into surplus in fiscal 22. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the purple bars. Those are still covered under the House Bill 1. For budgetary purposes, they're covered under the House Bill 1 estimates that we did in December of fiscal 22. But we did, again, we came to town December 14th of 2022, right where that 7.6 purple line is. We did estimates. We got good growth in the third quarter. The fourth quarter declined kind of commensurate with what we thought it would. And lo and behold, we were right on target with our adjusted estimate, but still versus those House Bill 1 estimates, we were short. Not short. We had a $1.4 billion surplus. All right, that's a little bit of history. Let's talk about the most recent history real quick, and that would be what's happened in fiscal 24 through the month of August. I would characterize the growth in July and August as strong, but a little bit on the non-recurring side, and I'll explain that. The sales tax for the month of July and the month of August was 5.3% in July and 5.0% in August. Those are, we expect that to recur. The actual nominal collections in July of $522.4 million, that was the second highest month ever in the sales tax. We've only been over $500 million 4 times, 2 Januaries, which are holiday sales, once in April, and then this is the first time in a summer month that we've cleared $500 million, and we did it gangbusters, 522.4. The individual income tax was a bit of a surprise in the month of July. It grew 4.4%, and withholding was up 3.2%, which we found curious because the rate reduction took place 1/1/23, which was a 10% rate reduction, yet withholding was up 3.2% in the month of July. So that was a bit of a head scratcher, but especially since it fell in 8.7% in the month of August. If you look back at July, though, it was a 5 Friday month, and we thought that withholding had gone past the old Fridays boost in receipts, but the real economy doesn't change from 3.2% growth to an 8.7% decline in the matter of a month. So I think the 5 Fridays hoisted up the July receipts. Investment income was $21.1 million in the month of July versus 3.3 the year before. So big time growth in investment income in the month of July. The last thing I want to say about August is we collected $36.4 million in a receipt thing that may have slipped by your gaze if you look through the receipts report quickly. It was the pass-through entity tax. And you think, what's the pass-through entity tax? It's that new tax that was passed in 2023, and I'm going to talk about that. But it brought in $36.4 million. And as I'll show, that's a transitory posting that'll go away later in the fiscal year. And I'll talk about that. But how did we use July and August numbers for our forecast? Well, 78% of the general fund is sales and individual income tax. Those two taxes, we took high frequency data forecasted in the month of September and then treated that first quarter of fiscal 24 as an actual historical quarter. We did that for individual, we did that for sales. It was not practical to do it for many of the other taxes. Business taxes, for instance, are up big time this year, 88.7% growth in the business taxes through the first 2 months. But, the big month is September, where we get estimated payments. The first 2 months, while showing, huge growth, 88.7% growth, not much of the money's in. So we wanted to wait for September declarations and not close out the first quarter based on 2 lower quarters. So anyway, that's how we use the July and August data. The last thing I need to talk about before we get into the tax-by-tax revenue estimates is legislative impacts. We've been busy with legislation for the last since 2018, really, a lot of tax legislation. We had major reform in 2018, and then reform in 2019, 20, 21, and then fairly substantial reform in 22, and I would say semi-substantial legislation in 23. So let's just talk about 23 for a second, and I'll talk about the others in just a little bit. You can see the bolded red line, and you can see some pretty big negative numbers from the legislative impacts from 2023. Fiscal 24 is negative $488 million. Fiscal 25 is negative $823 million. And fiscal 26 is $812.3 million. Big negative numbers. So with those big negative numbers, I don't think we're going to be going $3.1 billion up in the next 2 years because we do have some headwind from legislation. I'm going to specifically talk in upcoming slides about 3 of these items. The first one I'm going to talk about is House Bill 1, which is the rate reduction for the individual income tax. The second one I'm going to talk about is listed on this chart as House Bill 5, SALT workaround. That's the pass-through entity tax that I talked about before. And the third one I'm going to talk about is not legislation per se, but it's a sales tax impact that we need to discuss. and it was a legislative case, Century Aluminum, which you may have heard a little bit about, but I'm going to go into and discuss a little bit. So the House Bill 1 number was the biggest number on the page. From the 2002 regular session, the rate fell from the flat rate fell from 5% to 4.5% effective 1/1/23. We knew that when we did the December 22 estimates. That was a known commodity to us, so we've known that. What happened in fiscal 23 was House Bill 1 passed, which codified the rate reduction conditions for fiscal 22 that lowered the individual income tax rate from 4.5 to 4%, and that'll be effective 1/1/24. So in 2 years, we went from 5. We'll have gone from 5 to 4. Just in case you're wondering, the statute contemplates up to a 0.5% reduction each year. But for for the tax year beginning 1/1/25, that was based on rate reduction conditions done in fiscal 23. We've done those rate reduction conditions. We've turned them in, and the rate reduction conditions were not met in fiscal 23. So there'll be no rate reduction in 1/1/25 unless the General Assembly comes in and passes new legislation. So we went from 5 to 4.5, 4.5 to 4, and it looks like we may be there for at least a year. Oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. Now, the other one I promised to talk about on the individual income tax is this pass-through entity tax. It's the SALT workaround, as it's called, in the other 30 states that have passed it. What the deal is here is it's designed to give LLCs, LLPs, S-corps, in other words, entities that previously took income earned at the entity level, passed it through, hence the term pass-through entity, passed it through to the individual owners and members, and they were taxed at the individual level on that income. But when they were done, when that happened at the federal level, they were subject to the same $5,000 for a separate filer, $10,000 for a joint filer, SALT limitation that you and I have to be held to in terms of limitations on our state and local taxes that can be deducted at the federal level. So what a lot of states have done and what Kentucky enacted in 23 was we allowed these LLCs and LLPs to be taxed as an entity at the Kentucky level instead of passing the income down to the individuals. Tax them as an entity. Then they get taxed as an entity at the federal level, and instead of being held to that $5,000 and $10,000 SALT limitation, entities expense their taxes. They don't itemize deduct their taxes. So they could get full use of their state and local taxes paid, which afforded them some federal tax savings. So hence SALT workaround. We worked around that SALT limitation for those companies. I mentioned their savings at the federal level. If you remember that page, it was all red. So we scored this as a negative at the state level, mainly because the payment of this pass-through entity tax creates a refundable credit that gets passed through to the individuals to be used in Kentucky. And the combination of that refundability of that credit and some out-of-state provisions have led us to believe that that's going to have about a $13 million negative impact in fiscal 24, growing slightly in 25 and 26. But compared to the rate, we're talking $1 billion versus $13 million. It's not much money, but it is a new tax. And it's going to be a little confusing in the beginning because we've already showed $40 million to the good collected in July and August. Well, that money is going to get shoved out the back door later in the year when that refundable credit kicks in, and they can get refunds or lower estimated payments or whatever. So the net of that's going to be negative. So that's why I said a little bit of the money we received in July and August is a little bit transitory. Okay, so that's the individual income tax law changes. Sales and use tax changes. The biggest, start small. We did some clarifying definitions for services that were added in 2022, clarifying to make sure that those services are taxed at the way that the Department of Revenue could administer. We did not put scores on those provisions because it's conforming to what we wanted to do with taxation on those services anyway. There were some new exemptions added. The most notable exemption was the purchase of building materials, fixtures, supplies for water and sewer projects when a private contractor makes the purchases for a government. There's a lot of natural disasters in western and eastern Kentucky. We needed to make substantial improvements to water and sewer from the torn up areas of Kentucky. Some areas had private contractors do the work, and they were having to pay the sales tax. So now that the sales tax on those building materials is exempt. And that carried with it a fiscal impact of about $13.6 million in 24, which seems like a lot for that, but you have to keep in mind we had the federal money come in to assist in the building of water and sewer projects. The other change in the sales tax that I want to talk about briefly is the motor vehicle, the recreational vehicle situation. Recreational vehicle, non-motorized recreational vehicles were taxed under the sales tax before the 2023 session. The industry did not like that because not all states taxed RVs, non-motorized RVs, in a similar manner, and it put Kentucky at a competitive disadvantage in the sale of non-motorized RVs. So what ended up happening in the 23 session was we took them out of the sales and use tax and put them in the motor vehicle usage tax. So it's a switch from general fund money to road fund money. Not an equal switch, but so the sales tax impact was about $14.8 million at full implementation. That's a loss to the general fund, and a portion of that was made up in the road fund and motor vehicle usage. Winding up here, the other big number on the page was this thing that wasn't legislative impact. It was the Century Aluminum case. Again, not a legislative action, but it was a case entitled Century Aluminum versus the Commonwealth, the Kentucky Department of Revenue, and it was heard by the Kentucky Supreme Court. They handed down the decision December 15th, 2022, so right before the session. We lost at Kentucky lost at the Kentucky Claims Commission level. We won at the Franklin Circuit Court level. The lower hearing was reversed. Kentucky won at the Franklin Circuit. The decision was upheld at the Court of Appeals, so 2 wins for the Department of Revenue, but the Kentucky Supreme Court reversed that decision. And it's a fairly complicated thing, so let me just ballpark it. It's a Kentucky manufacturing and industrial processing exemption where we exempt certain items classified as materials, supplies, and industrial tools. The fact pattern of this case expanded the supplies the definition of what was a exempt supply. So that expansion allowed replacement, repair, and spare parts to be tax exempt, at least a portion of them be tax exempt. So that led to a fairly sizable fiscal impact. You can see the red numbers on the slide: 140 million in 24, 155 million in 25, and 145 million in 26. Seems like a lot, I know, but the estimate was done in two parts. One was the direct loss of sales tax, and another one is a look back, a 4-year look back, because of refunds for situations where people paid in, and now due to the change in the legal standing, there's a refund liability hanging out there. So that was that. Just a few more quick ones. The fiscal impact of other taxes. The car rental and ride sharing tax was not passed in 23. It was passed in 22. I put it on here because we mishandled the fiscal impact of that. We scored it as $7.9 million in 23. It ended up being $15.8 million in just 5 months of collections. So we missed it by half again, 100% error on that, 7.9 to 15.8. And the estimate for 24 is $39 million. So that's to the good on the other taxes. And the other one I'm going to talk about is the electric vehicle ownership fee. That again is a tax for the privilege of owning electric vehicles. That starts January 1, 2024. It's $120 a year for the registration of an electric vehicle, $60 for a motorcycle, or $60 for a hybrid vehicle registered after January 1, 2024. What happened in the 22 session was it got moved from the general fund to the road fund. So I've already showed I've already shown the impacts for the 23 session. Here are the legislative impacts that are going to get put into our estimates. And you'll read the subtitle, the 2023 session plus prior sessions. We had big numbers on the 22 session because of the first rate reduction from 5 to 4.5. So these numbers, the $1 billion, the $1.446 billion, and the $1.435 billion are the money that gets subtracted out of our estimates that we're going to present to you today. We've already netted them out, so we don't have to report them and then report those at the end. They've been netted out of each tax. One thing we didn't talk about was the major business taxes. That most of that money is due to a bill that passed in 2019 and had delayed implementation until 1/1/24. So that's been hanging out there for a long time and is finally hitting the books for us. The other, well, I'll just leave it at that. Those are the impacts that come out of the general fund as we go through our taxes. Gene Zaparnik Brown was nice enough to do this chart for me for the road fund. These are the numbers that notice these are all in black and the general fund's all in red. So the road fund gets money added in these various areas in the amounts listed here. So I probably went a little bit longer than you wanted, but I had to go through the tax law changes and how we got to where we're at. We're going to switch now to, unless there's questions, we're going to go through the general fund taxes tax by tax, unless you want to take a break or have questions. Thank you. How do you get this to start?
I think it's F4, isn't it?
F5.
No, F5. There we go.
Do you want to toggle? Or
Let me have that. Will it reach to me?
yeah, it should.
Go this way, Greg. You get your water. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting individual income tax. You can see in FY23 we declined by $3.4 million. And as Greg mentioned, the first rate reduction went into effect on January 1st of 2023. And the first half of FY23, we were growing very quickly with the receipts. The first quarter we grew 8%, and in the second quarter we grew 9%. And then after the rate reduction, in the third quarter we declined by 3%, and in the fourth quarter of FY23 we declined by 18%. And on net, that's a minus 3.4% decline for all of FY23. And then in July and August of of fiscal 24, we had small increases, and I think that has something to do with the pass-through entity receipts. And for various reasons, we're going to be seeing declines hit the net returns account later in the fiscal year. This is the same methodology that I've used for withholding for a very long time. I try numerous different specifications, but I can never beat this very simple model using Kentucky wages and salary as the primary driver. It's seasonally adjusted. I adjust first differences and I correct for autocorrelation. Now, there's all of the individual income tax legislation I've broken up. There's 4 pieces in individual income tax: withholding, net returns, declarations, and fiduciary. And all of the individual income tax tax law changes that you saw in the previous slide, those are 90% of the individual income tax is in withholding, and 10% is put into declarations. And I will have all of that work is done in the final page. As Greg mentioned, for sales tax and individual, we used an ARIMA model to forecast the September value to give us a full quarter for the first quarter of FY24. So it's history in our model. So where it says 2023 Q3, that is an estimated value, but in the quarterly model, it's counted as history. Everything else in this model is the same as I've presented in the past. Oops. The declarations model is a 3/4 moving average, and I accounted for seasonality by only using moving averages for the quarters, the respective quarters. So if I'm forecasting the first quarter, I took the last 3 years, the first quarter of each of the previous 3 years. And as I said before, 10% of the tax law changes were in declarations. Net returns is also a 3/4 moving average model, and the pass-through entity adjustment, which was minus $13 million for FY24, shows up in the net returns account. So the way the pass-through entity tax works, these entities will pay their pass-through entity tax in the pass-through entity tax bucket, an account, and then later they will get to write off that pass-through entity amount on their individual income tax, and it'll show up as a negative, and it'll show up in our net returns account. And they will not always show up in the same quarter. So that's why we feel that the deduction, the negative amount, will show up later in the fiscal year. And the fiduciary model is a very simple 3/4 moving average. Here's a summary of the legislative adjustments. The first column, the IIT, that's the full individual income tax tax law changes. And then the withholding, the middle column, that's 90% of the total, and the declarations column is 10%. And I chose the 90-10% because withholding makes up approximately 90% of the individual income tax. And the remainder I put in declarations because I thought it would be appropriate for the tax law change to hit the declarations account, because when they make their declarations payments, they're going to be deducting them, subtracting 10% off of that because of the rate reduction. Oh, and I've listed FY23 on here so you can see I created policy neutral series to do my forecasts. So in the withholding account, when I adjusted the history of the withholding, I added $310 million to the history values, did my forecast, and then I subtracted all of those amounts to the model forecasts. That got me my history back to the original history, and that got me the tax law changes in the forecast. And you can see Global Insight's forecast and our Kentucky MAC model's forecast of Kentucky wages and salary. This is the same that Michael showed you earlier. The pessimistic and optimistic lie nearly on top of each other, and all three scenarios are monotonically increasing with no dips even in the pessimistic scenario. Now this is the withholding forecast with the tax law changes already imposed on them. So the model results for withholding for FY24 had growth of 7% for FY24, 3.1% growth for FY25, and 3.3% for FY26. Then I imposed the tax law changes on top of the model's rates, and that gets us to minus 3.9, minus 2.1, and 4.1%. Now you might be scratching your head about the 4.1%. That's because the FY25 and the FY26 deducts were nearly the same. It was minus $1.2 billion in both of those years. So what you're seeing there is the actual growth rate from the model. The optimistic and pessimistic have very similar patterns to the control, and the control and optimistic are very similar to each other. And that just follows from the pattern of the Kentucky wages and salary. This is the output of the declarations model with the tax law changes already imposed on it. Was already a decline of 19.9% in actual receipts of 23. And then the model now is showing a deduction of 6.7% in 24, 0.8% in 25, and minus 4.3 in 26. Now the FY24 model results, the pure model result was $690 million, and that would have been the second highest declarations that we ever received. Then after I impose the tax law changes, that moves us down to $591 million, which is still the fifth highest declarations year we've ever had. Here's the results of the net returns model, and this includes the pass-through entity score, the pass-through entity bill score. The pass-through entity bill score was negative 13 million for FY24, minus 13.5 million for 25, and minus 14 million for FY26. And those are already imposed in those numbers. And here's the fiduciary. We're in very strange territory for fiduciary. We've been negative in the fiduciary account for a very long time. Now, the way fiduciary normally works is 10 months of the year we're in negative. So it's not unusual to look at year-to-date in fiduciary and find a negative balance for the account. There's only 2 months in the year where it ever posts positive growth, and that's in October and April. And usually what happens is it runs negative the entire year, and then in April it posts a large, let's say a $1 million or $2 million amount, and that brings it just above zero to a positive number. Well, in FY23, we ran negative the entire year and posted another negative in April, and that led us to the minus 5.7 for fiduciary for all of 23. Year to date, we're running minus $800,000 in the account, and that's actually, I'm sorry, that was last year. And this year, we're running minus $2.5 million in the account, and so we're about $1.8 million lower than we were at this same time last year. And that's why I haven't predicted a minus 5.7% for fiduciary, but we're definitely running in the negative, and I anticipate it to finish the year below zero again this year. Here's all four of the accounts summed together for total individual income tax. And you can see for the control, minus 4.2%, minus 1.3%, and 2.7% for the control scenario. And those large declines are driven entirely by the tax law changes. That's all I have for individual. Do you have any questions? The tax law changes are quite large.
I'm sure I already know the answer, but just to make sure. So when we're looking out to like fiscal year 25 and 26 and so on, this is a model that you're looking at with changes, I know, from the Kentucky MAC model and Insight and so on. So there's no specific things for, like, when we hear announcements like there's going to be a huge new EV battery facility or something like that, right? So I guess I'm just thinking back to what Michael was talking earlier about, there's some federal money being thrown at things and some new factories being made. So there's not any kind of point changes for any kind of big announcements or anything, right?
I'm not aware of any assumptions based on building new factories, but any assumptions that they made that affected U.S. wages and salary would trickle down into Kentucky wages and salary, and that would trickle into our withholding model, and that would automatically be built into the model that they gave to us. So that would be automatically in the withholding data.
We don't adjust.
There's no additional adjustment.
I think there's going to be 50,000 more.
Correct.
Manufacturing or construction.
I made no additional assumptions, and they didn't tell me if they did make those assumptions. So move on to coal. Okay. So FY23 for coal was a very good year. The third quarter of FY23 ended a 5-quarter run of 40% growth every single quarter for all 5 quarters. Then in the fourth quarter of FY23, growth slowed to a 5.6% growth. And I've presented here the July and August receipts collections for you. So we grew 1% and 22.2% in the last 2 months. The strength in FY22 and 23 was due partly to an increase in severed tons, but mostly to an increase in price. The last time we met, I presented to you the prices for Central Appalachian coal and Illinois Basin coal. Actually, I've got a slide on that. I'll get to that. So here's a little bit of history for severed tons. Oops, I didn't click the. Did it go? There it goes. So we're near historical lows. FY21 was the historical low for severed tons in Kentucky. That's for a full year for the entire state, severed tons in Kentucky, 20.4 million tons. And in FY22 and 23, we grew by 19.2% and 25.6%. So here's the most recent NYMEX spot market prices for Central Appalachian coal in the first column, and Illinois Basin coal is in the center column. So the last available spot market price for our Central Appalachian coal was $70 a ton, and for Illinois Basin coal it was $50 a ton. The last time we met, the spot market price for Central Appalachian coal was $187 a ton. and the spot market price for Illinois Basin coal was $186 a ton. So they've come down considerably, and not only have they come down by about 50%, but Global Insight says that the prices are going to continue to fall. I really wish Mr. Sinclair was here. I'd love to hear his thoughts. So this is should be a very familiar model to you. The specification you've seen before with U.S. personal income as the income variable, the income component of this specification. Sometimes real GDP is the best fitting model, and sometimes real disposable income is the best income variable for this specification. But this time, U.S. personal income was the best fitting model. Again, I ARIMA'd out the third quarter, so it's history in this model, and all seasonally adjusted variables and first differenced, and the first differencing took care of all the autocorrelation. So here, did it come up? Yep. There's two things that should jump out at you at the producer price index for coal. Number one, all three scenarios are nearly identical. So even though they have widely different assumptions in all three of their scenarios, they believe strongly that the price for coal is going to be very similar in all three scenarios with all of those assumptions. And the second thing that you should notice immediately is that the price is declining throughout the entire forecast horizon. So those are the assumptions that you're going to see, and this variable is probably the strongest effect in the model. So you're going to find our receipts declining in all three scenarios as well. I believe Michael presented the West Texas Intermediate scenarios for you earlier, and you can see that the control and optimistic lie nearly on top of each other, and the pessimistic scenario lies above those two scenarios. The Henry Hub price of natural gas, there seems to be some cyclical movement, but it's overall growing over our forecast horizon. And U.S. personal income, all three scenarios are very similar, and again, there's no dips of any kind in all three scenarios. Here's the three forecast scenarios. Minus 15.7% in 24, minus 28.9% in 25, and minus 14.6% in 26. That's for the control scenario. The difference between the control and the pessimistic scenario is just $2 million in 24, and it's just $5 million difference all the way out in 26. So they're very similar, the two scenarios. And there were no legislative changes added to this model. That's all I have, Professor. It's almost entirely a price effect.
Okay, next up on the queue is the sales tax. Sales and use tax, that is. These are annual growth rates that we've seen since fiscal 05. The fiscal 05 to fiscal 23 average growth rate, just a simple arithmetic mean of the growth, is 4.6% growth. So 4.6% growth is an average of the annual growth. If you stop that before the tri-peaks, it would be 3.3% as a long-term average. But again, the 12.0, the 11.0, and the 10.7 or 10.1, excuse me, are far and away the largest sales tax growth we've seen since 1991. The 9.2 we saw in fiscal 19 was a result of tax law changes. We added, I think it was 27 services effective at that time, and that brought in 9.2% growth in that year. We expected that to level off. And then we think that the 12, 11, and 10 had some stimulus components to them, obviously, but that's still the strongest growth we've had since we raised the sales tax from 5 to 6% in the early 90s. So really, really strong growth in the last 3 years. Not going to spend too much time on the quarterly ones. You can see I don't know if the cursor, yeah. If you look at these 4 quarters, those correspond to the first increase in the sales tax base, the addition of services. Of course, this was this negative quarter was the fourth quarter of fiscal 20, which was again what I call the COVID quarter, and the 31.4 is a bounce off the negative COVID quarter, but 31.4 percent is more than just a bounce off a low quarter. That's just phenomenal growth in that. Recent sales tax estimates are mixed. We underestimated the sales tax in fiscal 21. It grew at 12%. We underestimated that. Fiscal 22 grew at 11%. I had no earthly idea that we'd grow 11% off of 12%. We did. That was underestimated as well. We did overestimate the sales tax when we had our December 2022 estimates. We did use the optimistic forecast, yes, but we had relatively weak receipts in the second quarter and the fourth quarter of fiscal 23, which we still grew at a good percent in 23. What is the growth in 23? 10.1% growth in 23. We were just calling for a little bit higher growth in the optimistic forecast than the December estimates. Going forward, I'm still committed to using composite forecasting, which is a fancy way of saying I'm mixing forecasting techniques using time series models, both ARIMAs and VARs, and structural models. When we were having the run-ups, the 12, 11, and 10.1, I did some analysis for you all that showed that time series models did a better job of forecasting those up years, the 3 big years. Time series models did a much better job of forecasting those. Receipts are beginning to soften a little bit, and structural models, I did some in-sample forecasting this time, and the structural models, if you withhold 3 quarters of data, the structural models have predicted this recent softening in the sales tax. It's not soft, but it's softer. The structural models are doing a little bit better job picking that up than the time series models, which continue to shoot up a little bit. I haven't given up on structural models. I'm going to keep using structural models, but I'm also going to blend in ARIMAs and VARs. So to get to the model specifications that we used, these are calendar quarters. The time series for estimation, I have data back to 1990, the first quarter, but it doesn't serve one to use data back that old with all the policy changes we've had in the sales tax. So I only use data from 2010 quarter 1 to 2023, the third quarter. As I mentioned earlier, I did estimate September to make the first quarter of fiscal 21 historical. And to be precise, my estimate was $470.9 million for the month of September, which is 4.8% growth, is what I'm calling for in the month of September. September of last year, of 2022, happened to be a pretty strong month. $449 million in collections and 13.6% growth. So I am calling for growth over a strong quarter, but 4.8% growth instead of higher growth. And again, collections of $470.9 million, and that'll close out that first quarter, and I'm treating it as history. So fiscal 24 is only a 3-quarter forecast. In terms of model specifications on the ARIMA, I fit a 711, which is the autoregressive terms. I use the first, third, and seventh autoregressive terms. First differencing was enough to do it. And moving averages, I started off using a bunch of them, and I kept having to drop moving average terms because they weren't statistically significant. So I ended up with a 711 ARIMA. The VAR model, I used to run a VAR with withholding. Unfortunately, the VAR with withholding, I was not getting any of the cross terms to come in. And if you don't, like on the sales equation in the VAR, if you don't get lagged results of the withholding variable that are significant, there's no gains to using a VAR. You might as well, you're not picking up any of the lags from your other dependent variables, so there's no real gain to a VAR. So I use personal income, and I started with 8 lags, and lo and behold, I got a lot of the cross terms to fit with sales and Kentucky personal income. So I ran that in differences. All the models I've used, including the structural models, use seasonally adjusted indifference data. So the VAR is sales and personal income. I've tried sales and wages and salaries as well. That did not come in. So if I was going to use a VAR or a co-integration or a VEC, it had to be sales and personal income. The structural models, I try a bunch, and the 5 models that fit the best were, one of the structural models had nominal retail sales, including food services. I fit a model that had the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. There's a really cool variable in S&P IHS Global called state and local personal taxes that has a very tight correlation with the really high R-squared, really nice, even in differences it has a high R-squared. I use consumer durables, and then the 5th model is Kentucky wages and salaries. So I do run 5 structural models. Here they are depicted, so you can see the sort of the spread, the little bit hard to see between the lines. The top model was Michigan Consumer Sentiment that produced the highest sales tax forecast of any of the structural models I used. On the second one, the second highest is the state and local personal taxes that came in second highest, and at the bottom was U.S. retail sales. That surprised me a little bit, but U.S. retail sales, including food, was the lowest forecast in the structural models. So here's a couple graphs just to show some that Michael hasn't already graphed. This is the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. Everything's in the proper position in terms of optimistic, control, and pessimistic. The control is much closer to the optimistic on this one. The variable I like, the state and local personal tax receipt. This is a graph of the 3 different scenarios in that. I only went back to 2018 so you could see the gap between the forecasted values. And The only other one you haven't already seen is retail sales, including food services. Michael had one, but it didn't include food services. And you can see a slow growth pattern predicted by IHS Global. So those are three of the graphs showing our structural models. And what I did was I blended the blend. I took the structural blend, and then I blended that with the ARIMA and the VAR. The ARIMA model kicked out the highest forecast, which wasn't surprising to me. It has been kicking out the highest forecast. I think the 7 AR terms were enough to have it forecast the highest. The VAR with personal income, I think you remember back from Michael's slides that the personal income, I shouldn't say that. VAR doesn't use the forecast for personal income anyway. Just historical patterns of the personal income when the lags fit in, they had a depressing impact on the sales tax. So these were the three models that I blended. And as you can see, if you just eyeball it, the structural model is sort of right in between the VAR and the ARIMA. So even though I do composite forecasting, it's very similar to a structural model. And these are the projections that I came up with. Now keep in mind that this is the model minus the roughly $100 million that I talked about in my introduction due to the Century Aluminum case. You can see that the growth is rather non-impressive, but again, fiscal impacts. We will have grown about 5% through the first quarter. So in fiscal 24, I do expect a slowdown in growth for the remaining 3 quarters of the fiscal year. 5% in the first quarter, and they have to average 3.8 for the control, 4.5 for the optimistic, or 3.2 for the pessimistic is your spread. I was a little bit surprised as well that if you look down the control, 3.6 or 3.8, 3.5, 3.6. So sales tax is not jumping around much over the forecasting horizon, and I think that is indicative of the stability of the structural models. But not a lot of wild motions in the sales tax forecast. 3.8, 3.5, 3.6 in the control scenario. Just a few notes concerning the control optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. The range between estimates is relatively small. I have trouble with that a little bit because if you look at the last 3 years, 12% growth, 11% growth, 10.1% growth, and some pretty big forecasting years. And then when I have a forecast that's very tight, on one hand, I feel good that all the models are kicking out roughly the same type of response, leading me to believe that maybe I'm onto something in terms of all these models are saying the same thing, so maybe the truth is in there. But by the same token, it makes me a little nervous, given the volatility of the sales tax in the last 4 years, to have such a tight gap between the estimates. I will say on the optimistic and the pessimistic, you're probably thinking, what's he doing optimistic and pessimistic on a VAR and an ARIMA model? Because they don't kick out optimistic and pessimistic forecast. The gap in the optimistic and pessimistic is mainly driven by the structural components. What I did was I kept the VAR and the ARIMA model for the optimistic, since the ARIMA model was the highest model, I used 65 ARIMA, 35% VAR, and for the pessimistic, I used 35% ARIMA, 65% VAR. A little ad hocery, to use one of Frank's old terms, but it's what I did. I'll just come straight forward and say it. But I am a little concerned about the lack of variability between the models. But that's what. By the same token, I do feel good that you use drastically different methods and get pretty close to the same results. That was a good surprise to me. That's the sales tax.
Greg, I think you explained it. I understood what you did, but it seems like I've heard you once or twice say that, first of all, it's tight. So I guess I'm asking a possible if we hit an optimistic or pessimistic. As you said, is it going to be more variable? So I'm asking kind of a turning point question here. I think from what I heard, it seemed like a lot of this was most of the models ended up using Kentucky wage and salary income or personal income, which of course makes sense with sales tax. So I guess my question overall is less your model and more of like IHS market. Those I'm not surprised by those numbers because IHS market has the control pessimistic and optimistic. The wage and salary incomes are very close to increasing during all this time. But I also noticed that it has Kentucky jobs being flat, like increasing 0.5% and then decreasing 0.2 and then decreasing 0.1. So it seems like that all of this is about, I'm assuming that IHS market is saying jobs are going to be flat, but Kentuckians are going to get some big salary increases over the next so many years. I mean, if we're at 4 or 3.5% and we've got the same number of jobs, the only way we're getting more income, right, is to get higher raises. So I guess I'm just wondering, is that your sense that this is coming from market, IHS market, or I guess we call it S&P Global now, that they're saying we're going to get raises and that's going to lead to, therefore, more income and therefore more sales tax?
Two answers. The first answer is the wage and salary and personal income data I use was not IHS market. It was from the MAC model that we run, the Kentucky. They were Kentucky income, Kentucky wages and salaries, so which are based on the U.S. variables. So I may be drawing a distinction without a difference. But the other thing I would say in terms of increases in wages and salaries, think a little bit about the income tax forecast that we just talked about. We in the out years of that forecast, we fall from 5 to 4%, which is a fairly substantial percentage decline in the individual income tax rate. Yet the individual income tax doesn't fall near that much, implying wage growth and maybe some employment growth. If you didn't have sort of underlying withholding pushing you up, and the only thing pushing you down is the loss of rate, we would have seen much larger declines in the individual income tax rate. So yeah, I think there is an income effect that's helping propel, and the base expansion as well. We're making the base broader and broader and broader on the sales tax, so I think we're getting almost the full marginal propensity to consume.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that makes sense to me. I just want to make sure that we think about that if we're looking 1, 2, 3 years out, whether or not, to your point, there's not much of a distinction right now. So I'm wondering whether the MAC model or IHS, the kind of the underlying, it seems like it has us continuing as is for several years, whether it's in the pessimistic, the control, the optimistic. So I just want to make sure our group realizes, or maybe I'm off with some of these, but it seems like that's where it's coming from. So
yeah.
Whether or not we just think, yeah, we're going to continue, with what we've had, as you said, for the past 2 or 3 years, whether we continue to have that, or even better, maybe.
Like those structural model variables I put up, there's not a lot of bouncing around in those things. They're pretty flat. They don't have a lot of variability in the forecasted periods for consumer sentiment for retail sales and stuff. So when you have a flat forecast of your regressors, you're going to get a fairly flat forecast for your structural models. All right, we're transitioning to the Gene Zaporanic Brown portion of the program. So we're going to hear from Gene on the major business tax forecast and then property taxes. You want your mouse?
Yes. How do you, is it this? Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the major business taxes, which of course are the corporation income tax and the limited liability entity tax grouped together. We've been doing that for several years, partly because there's been we had difficulty with the commingling of money between those accounts to get a real accurate representation of what we are collecting under each of those taxes. So we talked to the Department of Revenue, and we talked internally and decided it was better to combine those in terms of forecasting. And typically we've had a good result in terms of our forecast accuracy, but you wouldn't know that necessarily by looking at how we've done in the last 2 fiscal years. You notice in fiscal 22, we underestimated the tax significantly. We missed it by $216 million, or 22%. We did much better last year in fiscal 23 when we only missed the forecast by $57 million. I will say part of the issue was the fiscal 22 was we had a very large increase in the receipts. As you'll see here, this is a history of the major business taxes. And in fiscal 22, we had a significant increase in the revenues there. That was approximately $300 million, or a 35% increase, which caught all of us off guard. Nothing in the underlying forecasts for U.S. corporate profits would have indicated an increase quite that large. And then we stayed fairly high. Last year we grew 6%, but we stayed at a high level. So kind of what's going on with the business taxes? Well, it's really kind of hard to pinpoint a single reason why those revenues surged. One is a strong economy. Another would be the repeal of the bank franchise tax. That was eliminated, and those financial institutions were then taxed under the corporation income tax. The estimate that we presented in past meetings was going to be an increase of approximately $59 million. So that was one of the things that contributed to it. Another is the significant tax law changes we had in 2018 and 2019. So kind of broadly speaking, there were 5 areas which were changed, and all of those can have a significant impact on our forecast. There was a reduction in the rate to 5%. There was the apportionment of income and the sourcing of sales, tax credits, group filing methods, net operating loss deductions, and then updates to the Internal Revenue Code. And each of those can have significant impacts. And the other thing is to keep in mind is with particularly the corporation income tax, there's a significant lag in getting any kind of data on these. So primarily, the filers are either on a calendar year basis, on the state fiscal year, or on the federal fiscal year. And like the individual income tax, those taxes are due on the 15th day of the 4th month following the close of that year. So if you think about a calendar year filer, say for fiscal 23, those let's see. So their tax year will run January through December. They'll pay in April. There's typically a 6-month extension to file, and then compare that to someone who's a fiscal year filer whose year would end September, and then add on the 4 months for until they pay, and then potentially a 6-month extension to file, and you get a real delay in getting the data. A reminder, as Greg pointed out earlier, all of these forecasts will have a reduction of the $48 million in each of these 3 fiscal years. So I look at the U.S. corporate profits forecasts before tax, and you can see where that has grown significantly over the last several years. With a dip a little bit in 23, the forecast does call for continued growth with a little bit of a flat area in there. I did zoom in, and yes, you can see early on the pessimistic forecast is above the optimistic and the control forecast. Unfortunately, I don't have an explanation for why that is. Global Insight does give some description of the forecast, but there's no discussion of that. I would say, however, the increase is fairly small and short-lived, so the impact on the forecast under that pessimistic forecast would probably be fairly minimal. So the forecasts under the 3 scenarios are all fairly similar. You'll see in fiscal 24 they all have double-digit increases ranging from 11.7% to 13.7%, reducing the growth rate being lower in 25 and then increasing a little bit in fiscal 26. That's what I have, unless there are any questions. Let's move on to the property tax. So looking at how we did on the actual versus the estimate in fiscal 22, looking at the bottom line, the total forecast I missed by $44.7 million. And when you look through the individual accounts, you will see that the motor vehicle usage tax, or the motor vehicle property tax, we missed by $49 million, while all the others were very close to the estimate, the actual collections. So what had happened, of course, with the motor vehicle property tax is, you'll recall that the vehicle valuations were rising quite high. The governor decided to freeze the assessments for the 22 and 23 assessments at the 21 level, and we reduced the forecast by $34.8 million, which ended up being a little bit smaller. It has to do with the kind of the way that that freezing of those assessments worked, and I can talk about that a little bit more when we get to the motor vehicle section. Then in fiscal 23, again, the forecasts in all of the accounts were fairly close. We missed it by $15 million, and the majority of that, $8.8 million, was in the tangible account. I don't have a good reason for that growth, but it did have growth that exceeded historical averages. One thing to keep in mind with these property tax forecasts, these are not model-driven forecasts. I've tried using models in the past. They don't particularly do well. But when you think about these assessed values, we're looking at assessed value of a stock, let's say of the motor vehicles or of real property, and that doesn't change much over time. And when we look at the history of these receipts, you'll see that they're fairly well behaved. So this is the total revenue, total property tax revenue, the history, fiscal 10 through fiscal 23. You can see there is just kind of a gentle rise of approximately 3% we get annually, with a slight drop in 2020. There wasn't much of a COVID effect here. So it's fairly well behaved. So looking at the real property tax forecast, we'll look at the accounts now. It's assessed by the PVA on January 1st at 100% of the fair cash value. That includes the residential, commercial, and farm property. Just to give you an idea, in 2022, the assessed value of real property was about $320 billion. The residential accounted for about 65% of that, commercial was about 27%, and then the farm property was about 8%. The growth in this is limited to 4% annually. Revenues can and have recently exceeded the 4% value, but then when the rate calculation in the following years, they take that into account and the rate is adjusted to reduce the revenues in the following years. And the revenue typically comes in a period November through January. This is the forecast for the real property in red. The history of that is in blue. The forecast is at 3% for each of those years, 3.8% for each of the years, 24, 25, and 26. Those are really kind of historical averages when we've had some fairly strong assessment growth, which we've had recently. The tangible property, that's self-assessed by the businesses primarily. The rates range anywhere from 1/10 cent to 45 cents per $100 of assessed value. And all of these property taxes, we're looking only at the state rates. There are local rates on motor vehicles and other things, and so, but we're only looking at the state portion. The tangible, this grouping of the tangible includes tangible property, which is business, furniture and fixtures, inventory, machinery. It also includes telecom property, commercial watercraft, and a portion of vehicles. I've got the forecast here. It does grow fairly. The forecast was fairly high in fiscal 23. That was from the business tangible. It had been fairly steady. You can see a few rises and falls, but the forecast calls for 4.5% growth in 24, 1.2 in 25, and 2.0% in fiscal 26. The motor vehicle property tax, the state rate's 45 cents per $100 with a lower rate for historical vehicles. You pay it in your birth month. It also includes personal watercraft, which would be your fishing boats, and jet skis, and some of the smaller items. One thing to keep in mind with the motor vehicle property tax, the property is assessed, of course, on January 1st of each year. So any assessment year covers 2 fiscal years. So anybody who pays in the first 6 months, say on the 23 assessment, 1/1/23 assessment, they're paying into fiscal 23. Anybody who pays in the second half of that year, they're paying in the first half of fiscal 24. So any fiscal year of collections will include 2 years of assessment data. That's important to keep in mind. So the motor vehicle property tax, it has grown very strongly in the last several years, and the forecast is for it to continue. Part of the increase is due to the strong sales in motor vehicles that we've seen in the last few years, and we'll see more of that in the road fund. Even though the assessed values were frozen for the assessments of 1/1/22 and 1/1/23, we did see growth in the motor vehicle property tax. Part of that, again, is strong sales in motor vehicles, and as new vehicles are put into the or part of the assessment, that's going to keep it fairly high. The other has to do with the way in which the motor vehicles assessment process works. It's a mass appraisal, so they take there's a system that has all of the motor vehicles in it. The Department of revenue gets a printout or a sheet from a valuation agency, and that is applied to all the vehicles that are in the system. So for the fiscal 22, when the assessments were frozen, that was an automatic assessment for anybody who had a vehicle in the database in fiscal 21. Now, there would be, other people would be eligible to get that, but they would have to talk to the PVA and make a case for that. Part of the reasons why you might not automatically get it, if your vehicle wouldn't be in the assessed value or in the database in 21, say if you moved into the state. So if you moved in and in 22, your vehicle wouldn't be in there. You would be entitled to a reduction in that, but it wouldn't be an automatic. If you bought a used vehicle from a motor vehicle dealer, that vehicle probably wouldn't have been in that database. It would have been as dealer inventory, and which was taxed at a lower rate. So not everybody automatically got the reduction in their assessment, but it was available to them. And then in 23, if you bought a 1922 car or 2022 car, you wouldn't have been in there. Omitted and delinquent, it does jump around a fair amount. The delinquent part is fairly constant. It runs from anywhere from $6 to $7 million, and the omitted, it can be 6.5 and historically up to 13. And then that's kind of expected to jump around a bit because the omitted property is property that's not on the roll, and once they collect on that, that property gets onto the roll. So the forecast here is for $17 million. That's just a 5-year average. It's been fairly steady over the last few years, so I just took an average for those 3 years. Public service company tax, these are your utilities, basically. Department of Property Valuation, the Office of Property Valuation and the Department of Revenue determines the fair cash value for three parts of that. That's the real estate, the tangible, and the franchise. They look at that as a unit and then apportion the value to Kentucky, and then the tax is applied. So the forecast for the public service is to increase, but fairly small amounts. So 1.1% in 24, 2.2% in 25, and 1% in 26. Roughly in line with what we've had in the last few years, a little bit of growth. So looking at the forecast, for 24, 4.4% growth in the bottom line, 25, 3.5% growth, and then 26, 3% growth.
What accounts for that jump in the tangible property taxes from, what is it, 22 to 23?
Yeah, that's a good question. That was primarily in the tangible business property. I don't know exactly what that increase was.
Is it potentially part of like you had these capital improvements through the tax break, and then you have to put stuff in those buildings?
Sure, that's
just because it does seem like there's a little bit of a structural change there, and that's affecting the outgoing years. And then, we're looking at an extra over $20 million there. So that's why I was wondering what was going on. Okay.
Any other questions? We've been at this for a little over 2 hours. I think that.
Yes.
So
$7 a pack, then you're gonna continue to smoke. But then fiscal 23 or fiscal 22 came in at negative 7.3, and 23 came in at negative 7.8, and I've got my forecast going down just a little bit further. We did add vendor compensation enhancement to the tune of about a negative $3.4 million fiscal impact, which began in fiscal 23. We now compensate at 1.5 cents per stamp or per pack. Just in general, what's going on in the market is prices are rising and discounts are abating. And I don't necessarily know if it's people quitting or people smoking fewer cigarettes per day. But it's unmistakable that quantity keeps declining in Kentucky. And it's one that I'd like to try to get a more formal model on. The monthly data stinks on the cigarette tax because they don't file a monthly return. It's a stamp order form, and so the payments for the stamps can be very irregular. What I'm trying to figure out right now is there a limit to the downward trend? And I don't know the answer to it. I talked to Michael about the MSA payments and trends, nationwide trends in cigarettes, but I am calling for an end to the downward trend in the forecast. I've got it going down 8% in 24, 7.5% in 25, and then a mere 6% in fiscal 26. But we're getting down to 239.4 million. We're getting down to where I'm starting to question just how inelastically these things are. One of the things that I think is contributing to the decline in cigarettes is OTP and vaping. OTP taxes have increased a fair bit. We're not losing sales in OTP, other tobacco products, being snuff, chewing tobacco, dry snuff, little cigars, etc. And vaping, of course, especially closed vaping, continues to rise. If you look at, I'm predicting 8% decline this year. If you look at, I know it's only 2 months, July and August, but if you look at July and August, year to date, we're down 6.1%. But August was a huge month, $29.1 million. A lot of stamp orders in the month of August. So I think that was maybe our big month for the year, and we're going to continue to erode. And then I have it, the rate of declines getting a little bit less over the biennium, but I don't have a great feel for this. I've been chasing it down the whole way, and I don't seem to be getting it low enough. But I do think ultimately there's a limit to how far it can decline.
Does vaping get captured in sales tax?
Vaping gets taxed as a separate. Well, it gets taxed as sales tax too, but there's a vaping tax, and there's a vaping tax on so-called open systems and so-called closed systems. The closed systems are these little, I don't know, they come in a cartridge, and they can be consumed with, I'm not a vaping guy, so I don't know, but the open vaping is where you buy the
It has to do with whether or not they're pre-filled from the factory or whether you repurchase liquid to add to it and reuse it. Closed is not reusable, open is reusable.
all the money's enclosed. There's very little that comes in and open.
Okay.
So anyway, that's I obviously don't do a control optimistic pessimistic for cigarettes. I don't have a good enough handle on it, but that's my forecast for cigarettes. We'll be within a couple million of the forecast, but hitting the growth rates I found elusive. So the Kentucky Lottery, on the other hand, has been a little bit easier to predict, mainly because of the language in the budget bill. The trends right now in the lottery are good. I remember just a few years ago that they toppled $1 billion in sales in the Kentucky Lottery. They're now up to $1.84 billion in total sales. Last year, nominal growth in sales was $164 million, or 9.8% growth in sales. The Kentucky Lottery continues to innovate in their terms to bring a competitive product to the market to keep people excited about their games and so forth. In terms of their product mix is not favorable to having the dividend grow as much as sales grows. For instance, scratch-off tickets they continue to be over half the sales, $943.5 million in fiscal 23. But that was down from fiscal 22, down 2.1%. Scratch-offs have a fairly, especially the lower price point scratch-offs have a high dividend component and a lower return to players. The higher the value of the scratch-off ticket, the higher the return to players in terms of expected value for a dollar wagered. Draw games, scratch-offs had been rising. They fell 2.1% last year. On the other hand, draw games had been falling. Draw games being Pick 3, Pick 4, Powerball, Mega Millions. Those had been sliding, and they were up 3.4% in fiscal 22, and that was mainly due to several big multi-state jackpots that accumulated in 23. They, Powerball hit $1 billion a couple times, a couple, 3, 4, 5 times even. Mega Millions topped $1 billion. So we've had these big run-ups in jackpots, and those periods bring in a lot of sales to the state. But the biggest growth in terms of sales for the Kentucky Lottery are the iLottery instant play sales. They've grown to $394 million, and that's up $167.9 million, or 74.3% over fiscal 22. If you look at their nominal growth up in the top there, they grew 164.5. Instant lottery or iLottery instant play grew 167. So all the growth is in iLottery. The problem with that, there's no real problem, but in terms of the reason that dividends don't go up as much as sales are going up is because the higher higher price expense for the iLottery instant play, they have the highest percentage payout to players relative to any other lottery product. So while one is inclined to think, well, sales grew 9.8%, so the dividend should grow 9.8%. Not so fast, because when the composition of the games changes, so does the prize payout change, and so you get less of a prize payout per dollar wagered, but you still get a higher prize payout or a higher dividend. This next slide explains the the 24 estimate at least. The budget bill that we talked about earlier, House Bill 1 from the 2022 regular session, had language in it that said if the lottery dividend exceeds these threshold levels, and for fiscal 24 the threshold level is 340,574,700. If it exceeds that, then the first 3 million in excess funds gets transferred to the general fund portion of the lottery dividend, and the rest gets transferred to a trust and agency account and can't be appropriated without the express authority of the General Assembly. So the 24 estimate is given the growth in dividends we've seen, is a no-brainer. It's going to be the 340, 574.7 plus the 3 million. So I know pretty much with certainty what the general fund portion of the 24 lottery is going to be. The only question was going to be what is 26 or 25 and 26. So to come up with those, I talk with officials from the Kentucky Lottery. We talk about their sales projections. We talk about their game mix. We talk about all sorts of different financial variables that they use, and we sort of jointly come up with a dividend schedule. And what we came up with was the general fund portion is going to go from 343.6 in 24 to 360 in 25 to 370 in 26. And since there's no language in the budget bill about transferring money into any special accounts, the entire dividend goes to the general fund. So that's our forecast for the lottery. I got, it's easier to read on this slide than it was the previous slide, but it's the same information. You can see in the bottom column chart that the general fund lottery dividend has grown every year since 23, 24, 25, 26, steady growth on the general fund lottery dividend.
Was there any way to account for the online gambling that's about to roll out in Kentucky?
I talked to them about that. They've had a lot of competition in recent years, starting with historical horse racing. The historical horse racing was thought to be very detrimental to the Kentucky Lottery in terms of just another outlet for a gamer to part with their money. But the historical horse racing has not had a negative impact on the Kentucky Lottery. And I talked to Maggie and Howard with the Kentucky Lottery Corporation, and they right now are saying that they don't anticipate a substantial threat from sports wagering. So apparently it's a different demographic that plays sports wagering versus the lottery. But it's a good question. You would think with just still another competition for your gaming dollar out there that it would potentially lower the dividend, but they haven't indicated that. It's a good question. So that's the lottery forecast. Lotteries are dedicated, with the money that goes to the general fund, it's dedicated to education, the Keys and CAP KTG scholarships. We're going to close up the general fund with miscellaneous other revenue sources. I said taxes, but it's really other revenue sources because some of them aren't taxes. They're just revenue sources. The other category contains 60 accounts that are not otherwise classified into a major account. The perennial big five are the insurance premiums taxes, the alcohol taxes, telecom taxes, inheritance taxes, and abandoned property receipts are what I call the five largest ongoing accounts. Parimutuel is getting ready to surpass abandoned property, sneak into fifth. But really, if you look at fiscal 23, investment income shoots way up the list because we, given those surpluses that we talked about earlier in the introductory slides, the surpluses, a good bit of the surpluses were deposited into the rainy day fund. The rainy day fund is invested in a short-term pool, and it brings in investment income for the state. And long story short, we made $150.5 million in income on investments in fiscal 23. I will say about the other revenue sources, many of them are estimated with annual data instead of quarterly data. Dr. Thomas Jones does do the natural gas, oil production, and mineral severance taxes. When he does the coal forecast, he goes ahead and does those forecasts for the other category in aid of my forecasting efforts. But even with that, I'm not including optimistic and pessimistic estimates for the other tax. It's just a control forecast for the other taxes. Now, I was a little disappointed in the other tax forecast in fiscal 23. It's only about $1 billion, and we missed it by $88.1 million, which I found disappointing. Of the $88.1 million, two of the 60 accounts made up the entire gap. The biggest part of the gap was income on investments. We brought in 150.5. Previous year was only 0.6, which shows the meteoric rise in investment income. The forecasted amount that we did in December of 2022 was $67.5 million, so we were $83 million over forecast in income on investments. So we took a much deeper dive for the estimates we're presenting today on investment income to try to narrow that down quite a bit. The rest of the 88 you could attribute a lot of places. I'm attributing it to the ride-sharing tax, which came in $7.9 million over estimate, as I described earlier. So those two taxes are $90.9 million over the forecast, and the total amount was $88.1. So just two revenue sources are enough to get a fairly sizable error in the other forecast. There were a couple other accounts that outperformed. Insurance premiums, we had a bit of a light bag in 22, 167.3. We estimated 188.7, which was stout growth, but we ended up with 196, which was 7.3 million over the forecast. And another revenue source was legal settlements. We forecasted 5.5. We got 16, so we were 9.5 million over the forecast on these legal settlements that turn off some money from periodically through the fiscal year. Since income on investments is by far the largest source of variation right now in the other forecast, I want to talk about it a little bit. It's not a perennial source of significant income up to now, but it did have $150 million of receipts in 23. The dramatic increase obviously comes from the surpluses that were deposited in the state's rainy day fund. the state's rainy day fund is invested in a short-term pool, and short rates, if you follow markets, and I'm sure you all do, have increased substantially in the last 8 months, a year, year and a half. Short rates have really been shooting up. Every time the duration of one of our investment assets runs through its maturity, we tend to reinvest at an even higher interest rate. So we're getting a good return on our investment. Really, I sat down for quite a bit with the Office of Financial Management, who was a great help on the income on investments forecast. Ryan Barrows, the executive director of the Office of Financial Management, very helpful. We went through the two parts of the investment income thing, and it's not rocket science. It's investable balances and interest rates. We had to make some assumptions on investable balances. We have higher balances in fiscal 24 compared to fiscal 23 because of the surplus in 23. However, we got input from the state controller's office and the state budget office on what balances would do from 24 to 25 and 26. We do have balances going down from 24 to 25 a little bit, and we're holding balances constant from 25 to 26. The investable balance changes quite a bit during a fiscal year. You would think that you think of a rainy day fund and you think of it locked away somewhere, ready to spring upon, but money comes in and out of it throughout the year to meet liquidity needs. So that balance will float around. Hence, we do a monthly balance forecast for the portion of the short-term pool that kicks off general fund dividends. And the other part of it, which Ryan was instrumental in helping with, is the interest rate components. We're expecting higher interest rates in 24 than we had in 23, which is going to help the forecast, obviously. And but rates are going to decline in 25 and 26, at least according to S&P IHS Global. And I do have a forecast that we worked on with the Office of Financial Management, $247.8 million in 24, which is almost $100 million over the $150 million that we got this year. 25 is going to go back down to close to $150 million. And 26 is going to go down to 123.9 million. That's our forecast. And the main factor at play is short rates. I'm not saying that the short-term pool invests in 3-month Treasury bills, but 3-month Treasury bills indicative of the pattern that short rates are expected to follow. And in 23, if you took an average of the monthly T-bill rates, it would be 4.1%. 24 is expected to be 5.4%, which explains that jump from 150 to, what was it, 247? And then by the end, from 24 to 26, the rate gets cut in half. So, aside from what's happening in balances, which is a slight shrinking, the interest rate component is what's going to pull the income on investments down, we think. So a chance we'll do better if interest rates don't fall the way that we do, but our best professional judgment is for the forecast. right here, 247, 148.8, and 123.9 is what we think we're going to get on income on investments. So, that big, if you put all the other forecasts together, I went long on investment income, but the remaining accounts are basically growing predictably, some less than others, some more than others. But the other forecast, we were just under $1 billion in fiscal 23. The big increase in investment income has other receipts bulging up to 1.1 or 1,131.5 million. 25, 1 billion. I can't read that. 55.7 million. And then roughly flat in 2026. So hopefully, with our beefed up forecast for investment income, we're going to be a little bit closer on the other forecasts than we were this fiscal year. That's what we're calling for. And again, we did not do control optimistic, pessimistic. Before we pull up the spreadsheet, which is what we typically do after we get through the general fund slide presentations, I want to just put up a couple slides on just general fund summary type slides that kind of set the stage for what we're going to look at on the spreadsheets. When you throw all the taxes together, blue's always control, red's always pessimistic, green's always optimistic. We're calling for 1.6% growth in the control forecast for 24, 1.2 in the pessimistic, 2.1 in the optimistic. So not a huge gap between the scenarios. You get a little bit bigger gap in 25, where if you took the pessimistic, you'd be calling for a 0.3% decline. Take that up 1.6%, and you get the optimistic at 1.3. Not much difference in the growth rates in 26, but if you go to the next slide, these are the gaps between high and low for fiscal 24, 25, and 26. So you can see that if you take the difference between the high and low scenarios, you get about 130 million in 24, 384 in 25, and a fairly substantial $486.1 million gap between high and low in 26. And not as big as some of the forecasts we presented to you in the past, but 486 million is still a sizable appropriation that a lot of agencies would like to have. So a fairly tight band. I was a little bit surprised. Last year we grew 3%. All the growth rates in 24 are substantially lower than the 3% we grew in fiscal 23. But a big chunk of that is the slide that I used in the introduction, which has the fiscal impacts of the last two legislative sessions, the 2022 session, the 2023 session. We did tax reform, and they weren't revenue neutral. They weren't meant to be revenue neutral. And, I believe the number wasn't $1 billion, Thomas? You take $1 billion out of the base, and that's going to, in other words, if you put that back in, the growth would have been more than 3%, which is what we saw last year. So a lot of the depressed growth that you see in the general fund is a function of the legislative impacts. So that's all the material we've prepared on the general fund. I do have one final slide. Keep in mind, on the taxes with alternative scenarios, there's only 3 taxes that have alternative scenarios, which are driving the differences between between control optimistic and pessimistic. the individual income tax, the sales tax, and major business taxes. All of the other revenue sources do not have control, optimistic, pessimistic. They just have a control. And with that, I am going to get out of the revenue slides and pull up. Yeah, if you don't mind.
It's not open. You'll need to double click it.
What?
The Excel file is not open. You'll need to double click it on the
Okay.
desktop.
Will do. Thank you, Thomas. General fund summary. Okay, this is a sheet you're accustomed to seeing. Right now it's toggled to 100% control, and it shows the growth rates that we just discussed. 1.6% growth in 24, 0.8% growth in 25, and a 3% growth in 26. The other thing I would be remiss not to remind you of, these are the preliminary estimates. We'll get another bite at the apple in December, and we can incorporate any new information or any new scenarios that the group would like us to incorporate to either get different scenarios you'd like to see. But these are the preliminary estimates we put before you for consideration.
Greg, could you refresh everyone's memory about what exactly, how exactly the forecast we approved today will be used by the various agencies and departments in developing their budgets?
Well, sure. I'm not the budget expert that Perry Nutt is, but the way I understand it, we already have a fiscal 24 budget out there by virtue of Hospital 1 that we passed. So, absent changes to the contrary, the fiscal 24 budget has some placeholders already. The numbers for 25 and 26 will go into sort of a soft budget, awaiting the final estimates in December. But I'm sure that the executive branch and the legislative branch will be preparing budgets using these preliminary estimates with flexibility to plus or minus the estimates as we get closer to the final.
Yeah, so this will be for the purposes of basically the rough draft, which,
Perry, is that safe to say?
Yeah, it would be the agency request for 25. And then what the General Assembly ultimately approves as appropriations, of course, are much different. But this is kind of the first step in the agency request for the next 2 years after this fiscal year.
The way this usually works is, well, Chairman, you can determine how it works, but in the past, there's these yellow boxes up here. We can toggle the different weights. The pessimistic is a residual, so we force it to add up to 100%, and it'll show you the different levels of estimated general fund. If you scroll down the page, you can see the official estimates for 24 and the differences between the official estimate for 24. The official estimate for 24, by the way, is the estimate you did in December of 22. It's not the enacted House Bill 1 estimate. It's the estimate you did in December of 22.
So I'm right now leaning towards the 100% control, and I'll give you my reasoning. 78% of the revenues are coming from sales and income tax. The remaining 22%, at least, and please correct me if I'm wrong, sounds like on net is going to have negative growth. That would require that the sales tax, which is going to be the bulk of this, to be over 3.8% in growth, which is below what the control estimates are saying, in order to meet the 2.9% growth rates that we've had up until now. So it doesn't sound like the optimistic is on the table, and the pessimistic to me seem way too pessimistic, and maybe that's just my reaction to it. So I feel safer with the control, and that's where I'm at right now, at least given what I've seen in those estimates. We also know that there won't be a trigger for an additional decrease on the income taxes, because that would have come into play if we had to worry about that as well. And I'm maybe a little bit more pessimistic than others. I think the Fed will go to 6% within the next 6 months, which would ultimately affect these even further downward. So that's my reasoning behind it.
Any others?
I'm generally one of the more pessimistic ones, I think, in this group. But I think I would be fine with control or maybe some pessimistic. But yeah, for me, the optimistic, I think, is off the table. I'm a little bit, maybe like you, I'm a little bit confused about it's in some of the graphs look like the pessimistic was employment really dropping a lot. And I'm not sure that I think I'm going to see employment drop that much in next year or two. And seeing as how with the numbers you've given us, it's such a tight bound. I'm probably fine with the control, especially because it looks like that for fiscal year 24, even the control takes us up by $250 million or so. And so I'd say between now and December, I think I'm fine waiting for control until we can redo the numbers.
Do we have a consensus? This is,
I have a question that
Yeah.
that I'm grappling with in even how to ask. Okay. So this is going to be a difficult question. So the control, we do these estimates based on these national forecasts with control in terms of probabilities of pessimistic and optimistic weights. Do we have any idea how Kentucky tracks over time in terms of how well the national control model holds for our estimates? And I don't know if that makes sense.
The question makes sense. The answer is we don't have that available. I'm trying to think how we would construct it. Because it would be, it's not something I can punch out on the fly, but it could potentially be something I could provide at the next meeting. Let me make sure I understand. So basically, you'd be interested in seeing how past forecasted values ended up matching actual values of the receipts.
The national forecast versus ours. So if I'm going back to Michael's presentation, our growth rates are typically less than national.
Yeah.
But our estimates are conditioned on that, correct?
The revenue estimates?
Yes.
It depends on the variable. Some of our tax variables use Kentucky. Sales tax uses all Kentucky. Wages and salaries and personal income, it uses Kentucky variables. The structural models use U.S. variables, but not personal income or wages and salaries or anything. But it sort of varies by tax. I'm trying to make sure I understand your question, so I
Are you
can-
asking about just the straight control or even their blend? Because they give their own probabilities to those three states, right?
No,
And those change over the
thinking
years.
about it in straight categories, like how well does our control compare to the national in terms of,
Make sure you mention the MAC model, because it's not a direct one-to-one relationship of what comes from global insight, what we present.
why don't you make that point?
Yeah. Or along those same lines, it might be, if I'm understanding what we're talking about here, if we compare, could we compare how the Kentucky forecast actually tracks actual Kentucky performance and how the national forecast actually tracks national performance? And what are the forecast errors in those two estimates? And would that be potentially useful information for us going forward?
And we have discussed that in the past. All I was making a point was, remember that the information that we receive from S&P Global, that information is to give everyone an idea of what is going on in the overall economy, what the expectations are across general broad categories, the parts that I present. Numerous analysts, not only do we take that information from S&P Global and put it through the Kentucky MAC model to make a translation of how we relate. So typically, for example, manufacturing employment. We have a larger manufacturing base in the U.S. as a whole as far as a percentage of working population. So of course, our relationship with S&P Global's estimate of manufacturing employment would be different than if we lived in, say, Hawaii. So we make that translation. Then, of course, each individual analyst, for example, Greg might find a variable for home furnishings that he says home furnishings at a national trend level often reflect underlying trends in housing and other things. And I find that that's a pretty good predictor for Kentucky at some sort of relationship, some statistical relationship for our sales tax or a component of sales tax. So it's a multi-step process. And we did talk about this at a previous CFG meeting, because we all came in after COVID and said, man, could we all be any more wrong? And it's because, again, there can always be large shifts in policy. We use the example of unemployment insurance. Had a medical, not medical, but a disease, an emergency, a pandemic. We wanted people to stay home, and we had, if I remember correctly, nearly $20 billion in unemployment insurance paid out. And of course, you might imagine that's going to change people's behavior. And so there's always going to be shocks to the system. But we have looked over the long-term trends at how well S&P Global, under many different names, I know we made jokes about they were just waiting for housing to rescue us out of the 08, what seemed so large at the time, the 08 pullback in the economy. They kept putting forth housing. And we thought, well, it's a good thing that we don't use a lot of the housing variables, because they sure seem to be putting a lot of emphasis on that. But I am sure we could construct some informative information for you to show how the different translations of the S&P numbers to the individual MAC models down, and again, another step down to the individual analyst estimates have tracked over time. Being aware, of course, that COVID threw a monkey wrench into everything, and so we know there'll be some off numbers there. And that's all I was trying to say about, just remember that my presentation on the overall national numbers is not meant to be a direct one-to-one reflection of what each of the analysts is doing to generate their specific tax forecasts.
I think we can do some analysis that shows for a past run of the MAC model or a past run of IHS market data, how accurate that forecast ended up being. But I would still posit that, we missed the forecast by $1.4 billion in 23, and it wasn't because we didn't forecast the economy right. it was, we didn't forecast the base year right, and the econometric forecast had a smaller role in it than just the stimulus money and some other factors that led the base year to be high. But I do think we can do some past checking of, at a point in time, what did the MAC model say and what ended up happening. We can do that, and we'll try to put some of that together for the next meeting. Let me write that down.
Sure thing. And they're probably going to want to talk about road funds soon.
So we were discussing whether we had a consensus around the control. So just to memorialize, the control forecast is for 15,394.2 million in fiscal 24, which is 1.6% growth. For 25, it's 15,514.9 million, or 0.8% growth. And for 26, it's 15,987.7 million, or 3% growth. Is that what we agreed to? Okay. With that, to keep things moving, we're going to go through the road funds slides. So, Gene, can you double click on your presentation?
Should be the third or fourth one.
And I think F5 gets it going.
So why is it not? There it goes. So, looking at fiscal 22, actual versus estimated, going straight to the bottom line, the estimate was within $4.7 million. Actual receipts were within $4.7 million of the estimate, 0.3%, so very close that year. Looking last year, fiscal 23, we were within $32 million. However, in the individual accounts, there were some much larger differences. Thankfully, the error in the usage tax was offset by the error in the motor fuels to keep us fairly close. Now, part of the problem with the motor fuels tax was we made our estimate on what we thought the fuels were going to be, and then right after that, the governor, through emergency regulation, froze the increase in the tax rate. So that had an impact on our error there. In terms of the motor vehicle usage, we'll look at historically how that's done. We've had some very large increases in that over the last few years, and much larger than we anticipated. So this is the percentage change in the road fund revenue from fiscal 10 to fiscal 23. And when you look at these percentage changes, it has a lot to do with the two biggest components, the motor fuels and the motor vehicle usage. Together, they combined for about 83% of the total. Early on, back in 2010, fuels was about 52%, and usage was about 28% of the total. That's gotten closer. Last year, the fuels accounted for 45% of the total, while usage accounted for 38%. But the early years, when you can see the large growth, that was at a time when the motor fuels tax rate was increasing every year, so we were getting large increases in the fuels. In the middle portion, where we had relatively low growth rates, that was when the motor fuels tax rate was remaining unchanged. And in these last few years, where we had this significant growth in the total road fund revenue, that's primarily due to the increases in the motor vehicle usage tax. So in terms of the motor fuels, as I talked about early on, you can see the large increases with the increasing tax rate. flat to, unchanging tax rate. So any changes in the fuels revenue was due to consumption, and then small increases in the last few years. A few details on the motor fuels taxes. There are three components of the tax. Two are fixed, one is variable. The variable portion clearly is the most important. It's the 9% of the average wholesale price. So we have to calculate that every year. For fiscal 24, that rate is 23.7 cents per gallon. You compare that to the fixed portion, which is either 6.4 cents for gasoline or 4.4 cents for diesel and LP. So the total tax rates, combining all three components for the current year, are 30.1 cents for gasoline, and the special fuels are 27.1 cents per gallon. The average wholesale price is calculated quarterly. It's a weighted average done by the Department of Revenue. It's weighted by formulation and the grade, whether it's whichever of the three grades it is. And again, it's 9% of the average wholesale price at the close of the prior year. The statutory floor is $2.17 per gallon, or 19.6 cents per gallon on the tax. And once set, that remains in effect for the entire year, unless, of course, we have special circumstances like we did last year. You recall in the past, the motor fuels tax could change on a quarterly basis, and in fiscal 2016, I believe, or in 2016, that was changed to make it an annual rate. And it's also limited to a 10% increase or decrease in any year. The model I have at the bottom is, I have two components. The average wholesale price model is actually a function of the pump price of gasoline, including taxes, and then the other component is this motor fuels, which is a function of U.S. Gasoline consumption. This is the retail price of gas, including taxes, which I use to forecast the average wholesale price, so that then, of course, we get the variable portion of the tax rate. And again, we see, which is not unusual with oil and then the price of gasoline, the pessimistic forecast is going to be higher than the control or the optimistic scenarios. Those other two scenarios, the control and optimistic, are essentially the same. We do see a drop off from the high in 2022, but increasing throughout the forecast period. So looking in the fiscal 23, the quarterly tax rates, for the variable portion of the tax rate, it was 19.6 cents. It was scheduled to go up to 21.6 cents at the start of the fiscal year. The governor had an executive regulation freezing that to prevent it from increasing. So for the first three quarters of fiscal 23, the tax rate, variable tax rate, was 19.6 cents per gallon. In the fourth quarter, it was 21.6 cents per gallon. We know what the rate is going to be. It's already been set for this year. It is 23.7 cents per gallon. So when we look at the difference in those tax rates for the first three quarters, the 4.1 cents increase is going to have a significant impact on the motor fuels revenue. It'll still increase in the final quarter, but the increase will be much smaller because this year in the fourth quarter, the variable portion of the rate will be 23.7 cents compared to 21.6 cents per gallon. For fiscal 25 and 26, that variable portion of the tax rate we anticipate will be set for the entire fiscal year. It is set to decrease in the control scenario, decreasing 0.9% to 22.8 cents per gallon, and then increasing in fiscal 26 to 24.1 cents per gallon. So the motor fuels tax rate under all scenarios in the current fiscal year is expected to increase between 12.3% and 14.4%. Again, that's primarily due to that essentially 2-year increase in the tax rate that we're going to get. Next year, under the control and the optimistic, small declines, approximately 2.5% under each of those, but in the pessimistic, we're expecting a small 2.1% increase. And in fiscal 26, increase under all three scenarios anywhere from 3.1% to 6.8% for those revenues. Under the motor vehicle usage tax, the rate is 6% on the retail price of the vehicle. There is a reduction on that for any trade-in on the vehicle, and I'm looking at consumer spending on light vehicles. I know Michael showed units on light vehicle sales, which are of course cars and light trucks. I'm looking at the spending on those. So the forecasts are going to look a little different. So you can see the motor vehicle usage revenue, the history from fiscal 10 to fiscal 23, and you can see a very significant jump in fiscal 21. We skipped right over the $500 million range. We went from $499 million to $620 million in 1 year. And we've remained at a very high level in these last 2 years. The increase in fiscal 21 was 24.4%. On top of that, the next year, usage revenue increased 1.3%, and last year it increased 5%. This is the consumer spending on light vehicles that I'm using to forecast, and you can see the forecast under all scenarios calls for a decline from those high levels of consumer spending, leveling out in the last 2 years. And again, we do see a little bit of the pessimistic, slightly higher initially, but not enough to make a material difference in the forecast. So the forecast this year calls for a slight decrease under the control, essentially flat, 0.1% decline, and small increases in the alternative scenarios, decreases in fiscal 25 of 2.5%, 1.6%, or 8.2%, and then growth in the 3% range in fiscal 26. And as a reminder from the introductory slides that Greg presented, these do include legislative impacts, $3.4 million in the fiscal 24 and $8.1 million in each of the years 25 and 26. The weight distance tax, it's the 2.85 cents per mile for the heavy vehicles traveling through Kentucky, calculated and paid quarterly, forecasted using an industrial production index of durable goods. It is fairly, here's the history from 2010 through last year, fairly stable, slight increases until the last few years where we did have some decline. Of course, we expect a decline in 20 from COVID, but not really as big as you might have expected. And then small increases in the last 2 years. This is the forecast of the variable that I use to forecast it. Again, a large drop in 2020. The control and the optimistic forecasts increase while the pessimistic has a decline early with a slight increase at the end of the forecast period. So last year, weight distance tax increased 0.6%. This year, under the control and the optimistic increases of 2.1 and 2.5%, small decline under the pessimistic. Increases again in 25 under the control and the optimistic, decline in the pessimistic, and in 26, increases in all three scenarios. The motor vehicle operators, this is your license, your license. So Kentucky, of course, is transitioning to the real ID for driver's license permits and personal IDs. You can get a 4 or 8 year license or a standard credential for the real ID. So that's an increase in the fees, and I use NAREMA to forecast this. It's a fairly stable series, as you'll see. You can see in the first part of this, up until 2005, very small increases, about 2% annually. There was an increase then in the license. It jumped straight up and then remained at about 15 million with about until 2019. That's about a 1.3% annual increase over that period. Again, it's very stable. We had the drop, and then you can see another increase with the real ID. It's got an increase in the cost of that and an extended life, 4 or 8 years for those, which is longer than the current IDs. So I went ahead, last year it grew 4.3%. I took the 1.3% annual growth that we had seen in the most recent stable period before the increase to real ID of 1.3% and applied that for the 3-year forecast. The license, these are your plates. Primarily it does come from passenger cars and motorcycle license plates. And then there's a truck proportion registration fee, which is part of the IRP, the internal or international, I forgot exactly what it is, but it's collected at the U.S. level and distributed back to the states. I forecast that using U.S. registered vehicles. When you look at the history, it did have some ups and downs. Primarily that was the IRP money. It came in lumpy. It didn't come in all at once in any particular fiscal year. However, in the last 3 years, that has stabilized, and we're seeing more stability in the collections on the license revenue. So these are the registered cars and light trucks that I use to forecast this. Continuing on about the same growth path with the optimistic slightly higher and the pessimistic slightly lower. Forecast calls for essentially 2% increase under all scenarios in 24, 1.5% in 25, and 1.5% in 26. All very close across the 3 scenarios each year. The investment forecast, Greg talked significantly about what they do on the general fund. I will say that the road fund is in a different pool, but the forecasting is the same. I send over my road fund forecast to transportation personnel in the budget office. They have a model that they use to get investable balances from my forecast. They send that back to me. I forward that to Office of Financial Management, asking them to apply the expected interest rates to that, and that's where the forecast comes from. So the forecast this year is for $16.3 million, falling a little bit in 25 to $8 million, and in fiscal 26 to $6.7 million. And then the other receipts are primarily fines and fees. I use NAREMA. It accounts for less than 3% of the total road fund receipts. Again, the history. It does bounce around a bit, but it's the last few years it's been very stable at about $42 million. So the forecast increasing slightly in each of the next years up to $49.8 million in fiscal 26. These are the total road fund forecasts for the 3 years. The control 7.2% this year, a decline 2.1% next year, and an increase of 2.8% in fiscal 26. That's the road fund.
Questions, discussion. I'll get us started by if control was the consensus on the general fund. Is there any reason it should not be for the road fund? Are there any questions about any of the components of the road fund? All right, it looks like we have a consensus on the road fund, the control forecast.
All right, then we will wrap it all up with everyone's favorite, the MSA. So, since we have no new members and everyone has seen the slides before, I'm going to go through them very fast. So we all know the Master Settlement Agreement has been in effect since 1998. 52 states and territories are collectively the settling states. The largest manufacturers were the original participating manufacturers to the agreement, and those that have come along since are the subsequent participating manufacturers. They agreed to not have public marketing and exchange the state's settled concerns about healthcare costs. And of course, we've been receiving our payments over the years. Last year, for fiscal 23, Commonwealth received $118.3 million, which brings our collective total since the beginning of the MSA to $2.67 billion received by the Commonwealth. There are three potential adjustments to the payments. The first is the inflation adjustment. As you might imagine, for the first year, there is a base 3% annual inflation adjustment. So each year, the CPIU from December to December must exceed 3%. Otherwise, the inflation adjustment is 3%. We are right now right at that level. We are at just over 3%. So depending how we go from here to the end of the year, we will receive either the 3% if inflation falls back, or we will receive the actual. And when this forecast was prepared, we were under 3%, and so I had assumed 3% inflation, the base level in all years. The volume adjustment, which up until just a few years ago, it was quite simply as cigarette sales were lost by the participating manufacturers to those non-participating manufacturers, the amount of the payment was reduced. The amount of the volume reduction is now such, without the inflation adjustment, there would be no MSA. They have lost so many sales that it would essentially be negative. And so the inflation adjustment keeps the numbers into the positive. The volume adjustment would by itself drag it below zero, but the two balance out to our current amount that is distributed across all parties. However, a few years ago, a small part of the MSA started to become more important, and that is what's known as the profit adjustment. It actually is related to the volume adjustment, but what it says is that we're going to look back at your 1996 operating revenues. We're going to grow them by actual inflation, and if you have become more profitable under the time period of this agreement, we will reduce the volume adjustment. So lots of profits means you get less of a volume adjustment. And a couple of times, 2018, I believe, $30 million. Now we're talking on a $7 billion base. They reduced it by $30 million. Well, we actually have started to have serious profit adjustments into the neighborhood of nearly $500 million in 2021. Who knew during a pandemic that involved a disease affecting the lungs, people would go out and make cigarette companies more profitable? But they did. And so I have assumed, using the forecast that we have received from S&P Global and Gene's work, that we will probably not be seeing cigarette profits larger than inflation-adjusted 1996 operating income going forward. And then, of course, last but not least, the ultimate unknown is the non-participating manufacturers adjustment. We have actually seen in the last few years, there have been firms removing themselves from the American cigarette market. And as you might imagine, the firms that decide it is no longer profitable for them to operate or no longer desirable for them to operate in the United States, when they leave, the kinds of folks who are out there buying their cigarettes do not suddenly switch over to Marlboros. They typically go with a cheaper brand, which is, everything else being equal, often a non-participating manufacturer's product. As a result, we have been seeing larger and larger amounts. The current sales year number that we have available, The amount that would be in dispute for states that have not settled the NPM adjustment would be approximately $1.5 billion of, again, that approximate $7 billion base payment that needs to be decided. And as you may recall, they've been working diligently, that's kind of a pun for those of us who deal with the diligent enforcement question, to work their way through the back years. They've now made it to 2004. You may recall in 2014, we were found to be not diligent in the 2003 NPM adjustment decision. I don't think any of us are going to be around by the time they catch up to the current sales year. It's at least not doing this business. And so, needless to say, we have been in talks to settle these years. We are in current talks to settle the NPM adjustment for the next several years, and possibly at a percentage split that is more favorable to the Commonwealth. But we have settled all disputes up through the calendar 22 sales year. So we have not yet had that agreement with the OPMs and SPMs. Therefore, I have not included that in this current estimate. I do think that will be in place when we are back here in December. So the current estimates, which do involve, much like Greg was saying, some rather large declines. Over the history of the MSA, we have averaged a 4% decline each year in cigarette sales. It was strange. We had absolute flat during COVID. People must have been nervous. But now we've seen 9 and 11% annual drops since. So it is picking up, and whether it's people switching to vaping or maybe improving their health and switching from using any tobacco-related products, we are now seeing much smaller overall volumes, which again is going to impact the sales and the subsequent MSA payments. So my current estimates, much in line with what the National Association of Attorney Generals is also telling states, that we would be seeing approximately $102.6 million in fiscal 24, $97.3 million in fiscal 25, and $92.5 million in fiscal 26. And we do not prepare a range of estimates. There is no optimistic nor pessimistic forecast for the MSA. But like I said, when we come back in December, we'll have a better idea where we are on the inflation adjustment, and there's a very good chance we will have an agreement in place for the next several fiscal years. So I do expect that there is a possibility that these numbers will be going up slightly in December. I don't see much more downside risk at this point to the MSA numbers, but that is our current planning estimate. I would also like to use my time to say I hope to see you all at the KEA on October 20th, because I am shameless and I will plug it. So, but in all seriousness, I do hope you all come down to Berea. It's going to be a wonderful program, a wonderful day, and I do hope that you make it.